Greetings, everyone. I think I heard myself in Micah's background. That's how lively my voice is in this here, not morning. I guess it's 12 o'clock. That's a millennial morning when it's 12 p.m. It's not the morning until it's at least 2 p.m. in my book. But thanks for joining us for another Three Wonks episode. Three Wonks is a primarily policy-focused podcast with three policy wonks. Three, featuring Socialism Done Left, who is a socialist, New Liberal Micah Irfan, and myself, Social Democrat and Boy. SDL's MIA. We don't know where he is. We hope he's doing all right. For now, it's just going to be Liberal Micah Irfan and Social Democrat Boy. I'm sure we'll be able to get through these topics. It's actually kind of some quick topics today, guys, so we'll see how it goes. Of course, we'd like to thank all of our Patreons who support a policy-dense show in a polarized and sensationalist media environment. If you would like to become a Patreon to support our show, please head on over to patreon.com/the3wonks and become a member for as little as $3 a month. Get some cool benefits and support a cool show. Of course, today we're talking about what is almost certainly going to be the next government of the United Kingdom, the Labour Party and their manifesto. What are they running on? Why should we even give a shit? And also, what are they going to do? Right? What are they going to do when they're in office? And that'll be an interesting topic. I think, the UK would have to be the biggest. I don't know if there's a bigger election between now and the end of the year. So it's definitely a very consequential election. Obviously not including the American election, for God's sake. So afterwards, we're going to talk about Trump's tax plan. So his universal tariffs that replace the income tax idea. That'll be interesting. And we'll probably sprinkle in some things throughout the discussion as well. Micah, how are you doing? How is life?
Well, life is good. Life is great. I was up late last night watching The Acolyte. That's a great Star Wars show.
Really?
I don't usually watch Star Wars
I've heard
shows.
only bad things, Micah. Literally, only bad things.
It's actually so good. I don't watch shows, but this is a really good show. I'm obliged to watch all Star Wars content because Mark Hamill commented under two of my tweets.
That was unbelievable. I could not believe. I literally couldn't believe my eyes when I saw that. I was like, Mark Hamill just commented on Micah Irfan's tweet.
He likes my tweets all the time too. It's so great. So
get him on the podcast, Micah. What the hell? We need to have Mark Hamill as a guest.
I've been working really hard. I'm really looking forward to the Democratic Convention where I'll be on the platform committee. Okay, we got YIMBYism in the Texas Democratic Party platform. 3 beautiful planks that I wrote. And that made it into the Texas Tribune. Now I'm working on trying to do the same thing for the Democratic National Convention's platform. Now, of course, as somebody with a Biden sign in the room, the debate was certainly a little bit disheartening for me. But as the president says, keep the faith, okay? You got to keep the faith, and I'm trying my best.
Yep. Gavin Newsom says you don't abandon a guy after one bad performance, which is true, I suppose. Probably give Biden a little bit of a break. But, man, that debate was, I literally, the first 15 minutes of the debate, I was like, it is over. It's over. It's over, guys. It's like, have you ever seen, what's that, like, really, it's like, at this point, it's kind of an old show. Have you ever seen West Wing, Micah?
I've seen a little bit of West Wing.
All right, well, there's a moment where the president's debating against the governor of Florida, who's like the Republican nominee, and the governor of Florida does so badly in the debate, he goes over to shake the president's hand after the debate, and he goes, it's over. And then, like, the election basically, the election arc just, like, ends on the show, essentially. And I was like, dude, Biden's getting crushed in this debate in the first 15 minutes. He brought it back in the last 15 minutes, but I don't know, man. It was nearly optimally bad.
90 minutes of, our nominee or presumptive nominee just kind of standing there with his mouth open is certainly not amazing optics for us, especially when that's his worst weakness. And I know there's been a lot of debate internally over whether we should replace him or not. The reality is it's ultimately his choice. There's going to be no replacing him unless he wants to. And there's really no point of us, whining about it on Twitter and turning our entire news cycle into a question about whether he should be our nominee or not, because frankly, that just helps Republicans. And so I've resolved what I've always resolved, which is I'm going to do exactly everything that I possibly can because the Republicans' agenda is so existentially threatening to our country. And, ultimately, fate will be what it is.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. Noah Smith, he actually released an article. Well, he released an article, but then his tweet, I think, said almost more than the article, which was that Biden's debate performance has forced us to more seriously contemplate what a second Trump term would look like. And I think that that's the biggest takeaway from the debate, is that it's getting real, man. It's only 4 months until the election, 4.5 months until the election. It's not even 4.5 months. It's like 4.25 months until the election. And, it's a bad debate performance, obviously. And so, hopefully he can recover in this next 17 weeks, basically, until the election happens. So,
the thing is, the thing that everybody needs to clarify is that there's not a question about whether Biden can serve as president. Because ultimately, when you vote for president, you vote for an administration. It's not like no decisions are going to be made just because Biden's old and he's not as mentally there as he used to be. The real question relating to his age is whether he is able to win. Because to win, you need to campaign. And a lot of the public think about votes for president as votes for an individual and not an administration. And so that's really what the question is about. I'm just as confident as ever that the entire agenda of the Biden administration is going to be the exact same. It's going to be just as successful if he gets elected this time than if he was elected when he was 20 years younger. Because frankly, his mental there-ness is only a very, very small piece of the pie.
Yeah, it was interesting because the actual polling didn't seem to shift too much. Like, it was interesting because the overwhelming number of people, I've seen polls, 2/3 of people, 4/5 of people definitely recognize like Trump won this debate. But then when you ask them, well, what's your voting intention now? Almost no change. Very little change from just what the aggregate polls were saying. And that was actually extremely interesting to me, because what it showed me was that the polarization is like very real. It's extremely real in this country, where like it really does seem like vote blue no matter who is like a real sentiment amongst a large portion of Democratic voters, and whatever the equivalent is for Republican voters, like just whoever the fuck has Republican next to their name, we're going to be voting for him. And like the middle, the sort of non-polarized middle of the country, which aren't necessarily moderate in their politics, but they're just a bit undecided voters, swing voters, is really a pretty small portion of people at this point.
Well, or maybe they were both activated, like they were activated in equal numbers, because I think there was two effects working against each other. Like first, Biden looked terrible, right? So that certainly helps Trump with a lot of swing voters. I'm sure many swing voters watch that and they're like, I just can't vote for the guy who can't talk, right? I'm just going to vote for the guy who can talk. But also there were a lot of swing voters, which I think totally forgot like what Trump's like. And I think for a lot of young people, that was the situation where I've talked to a lot of young people in conversations, and they just haven't been able to really recall how they felt when he was president, what he was like, why they voted against him in the past. And him being there and talking about black jobs. Talking about how he's going to end the war in Ukraine before he's president, only if he wins. He sounded pretty bad. And so I think that didn't do him any favors. I'm sure that itself, created a movement for some voters in the opposite direction.
Well, yeah, on the panel that I was on after the debate on Wick's channel, Wick was making the point, which was like, hey, Republicans who think Biden did terribly, just consider this fact. Biden did terribly because Biden is not the strongest candidate, but Trump still couldn't bury Biden in this debate. Like, Trump is a terrible candidate as well. That's something that's worth keeping in mind. I saw people, like, I remember in 2012 was the first presidential election that I really, really followed when I was starting my political journey. And my political journey started before then, but this was the most recent presidential election that I could actually follow really closely. And I remember people back then saying, oh my gosh, both of these candidates suck. Why do we have to pick between Mitt Romney and Obama? It's the worst. Oh, you sweet, sweet, dear summer child. Yeah, like, and people were posting clips of the presidential debates between Romney and Obama, and it's literally, it's night and day on two different planets in two different galaxies. Like, it is like an unbelievable difference between like the quality of the debate was just much different. Obviously, Mitt Romney versus Obama. And to be fair, I mean, Trump has aged too, right? If you look at the Hillary versus Trump debates, Trump was a lot more lively and a lot more coherent in those debates as well. Hillary obviously was a very strong debater in those debates, and so it's really only until we get to 2020 and obviously now the 2024 debates where we end up with, especially, I mean, Trump was crazy in 2016, but I think that his train of thought was at least a little bit slightly more coherent in 2016. But anyway, because, I mean, one thing that Biden was quick to point out, which was true, is that it's like, this guy's only 3 years younger than me. Like, he's a fucking old man too, right? And that's probably something that Biden should hit on a little bit harder. It's like, this is not some spry youngster that I'm running against. Like, this was the other oldest president in history.
And it's clear that he's having mental decline too. And, this is something that gives me hope. I think that if Trump wins, God forbid, and somehow we're able to manage to resist him hard enough so that he actually doesn't completely destroy elections and democracy. Well, certainly can't take that for granted. That will be successful. I think he will be extraordinarily unpopular by the end. People are going to remember, first, he's going to be extremely radical. He's also going to be less charismatic than ever before, and his cognitive decline is going to settle in because he's going to be 81 years old by the time it's over. Yeah. And that next election, the following one, will be an election where both parties nominate somebody young, and the entire public is like, we're really tired of this shit. We're tired of these old geezers.
No, I mean, if Donald Trump, if he wins the second term, I think he leaves office with a 30% approval rating. I think he would be incredibly unpopular, and I think the midterm, I think that's when it'll start. I think that the midterm after Trump wins the second term, especially because by all accounts, his first 2 years in his second term are going to be amongst the craziest years in American political history by forecast, let's say. I think that if he wins, I think that the midterm afterwards, I think Democrats will win 275 seats in the House, and I think it'll be 54 Democratic senators in the Senate. And then I think in 2028, you'll see a Democratic landslide again on top of a Democratic president getting elected. Because, I mean, look, this is one thing that I've said for years now, which is I dare the Republicans to pass their agenda. I dare them to. If they actually elect a fucking Republican and they actually have a unified government that actually is allowed to enact the full Republican agenda, not ending democracy or anything like that, but if they actually enact just their domestic policies.
Please don't dare them to do that.
Well, but even if they did that, Micah, obviously there'd be riots in the streets and there might be a revolution if that happened. But if all they did was just enact their legal domestic policies and foreign policies, the American people will fucking electorally revolt against the Republican Party, and they won't win an election for a decade. Okay, because I mean, just the Supreme Court getting rid of Roe v. Wade seems to have resulted in a structural 5 percentage point bump for Democrats in every subsequent election after that. And that was just getting rid of Roe v. Wade. If they actually get rid of gay marriage, they get rid of our ability to regulate Wall Street. If Republicans enact things like a nationwide abortion ban, if they get rid of Obamacare, if they defund Social Security and Medicare, good luck with that. Good luck with that. Doubt that'll be very politically popular. Could be wrong though. Could be wrong. Just don't imagine that'll be very politically popular if I had to guess. But
I really hope for the best. Now, in my biggest concern, and I really think the best case people have made for switching nominees, is just that if we win, it's not enough for us to win just this time. It's not enough for us to win by the skin of our teeth the presidency this year and then completely get destroyed in the next midterms and then lose the next election because our presidential candidate is extremely unpopular because he's so old. Imagine Biden at 86 years old when he leaves office. If he wins another term, he's not going to be particularly popular. If he steps down and Kamala Harris becomes president, she's not going to be particularly popular. And frankly, I like Kamala Harris. People can hate on me all they want. I think she's totally fine.
Kamala Harris, Micah.
Oh, okay, Kamala Harris. But she has a ridiculous amount of haters. She has incredibly high negatives.
Yeah.
I can't tell you why. But it's not going to be good news for us.
Micah, join hands with me and support. And, because I'm unironically more supportive of Aiden's argument as the days go by. AOC 2028. I think she might actually be the best. Look, she's young. She has a great ability to public speak. Okay, she's not like a crazy radical progressive. She's she's like not. I mean, certainly she's very progressive, obviously, but she's also Latina. That she's gonna get a lot of Latino Americans, Latinos who vote for her and stuff like that. That's good as well. I think she unironically would be like a pretty strong 2028 candidate if she was able to win the Democratic primary. I mean, I don't know if she'll win the primary.
Totally disagree.
Oh my god.
Totally disagree. I think people mistake what the base of the
Oh my
Democratic
god.
Party
Really quick,
is.
Najwan, you're such a dumb fucking chat sometimes. I swear.
Wait.
She did a lot of anti-Semitic dog whistles recently.
Okay, that's ridiculous.
AOC is not anti-Semitic, you dumbass. I mean, I love you, Najwan, but come on.
The problem that people have, a lot of political commentators have, is they don't understand what the base of the Democratic Party is. The base of the Democratic Party is older African Americans and older white women. Period.
You think they wouldn't vote for AOC? They'd vote for any Democrat.
No, they would not vote for AOC.
You think black people just would decide, oh, this is the election, we're not going to vote for Democrats because AOC is at the top of the ticket?
No. They're not. She's not going to win the primary.
No. Don't get me wrong. I'm not talking. Oh, look, if AOC won in 2020, or I'm sorry, if she ran in 2028, I'm not saying she would win the primary. I'm just saying strategically, if we could pick who the best Democrat would be, I think she would be pretty strong. Like she'd be at the top of that list.
The best candidates are the candidates that can keep your base and energized and also go on offense with certain bases that we struggle with. For instance, like in the state of Texas, we have State Representative James Talrico, who is very good at keeping and energizing the Democratic base, but also he's able to make a message that appeals a lot to Christians and bring more Christians to our side because of his very religious background.
2028, that guy.
He would be great, right? Gretchen Whitmer is a good candidate because she's able to energize the Democratic base, but she's also able to go on offense with a lot of these more suburban voters, get us more women. I mean, we do well with women, but we don't completely dominate with women. And like many more moderate Republican swing voters would be interested in voting for a person like Gretchen Whitmer over a person like AOC, which they perceive to be more radical. So I think if you ask me, I think certain candidates like Andy Beshear, Gretchen Whitmer, I think Pete Buttigieg would need to be a VP. I think he's getting a lot better at communicating, but he still has a reputation from 2020 that he hasn't been able to shake as being like very stock. I think Gavin Newsom's not a good candidate. I think Raphael Warnock is a fantastic candidate. Wes Moore is a good candidate. And Michelle Obama, I'm telling you, we put up Michelle Obama, we win the election. I don't care what the context is.
I think John Ossoff should be on like anyone's VP list if he's not the nominee. He would be an incredible VP pick if you ask me. Raphael Warnock as well. I mean, that's one thing I said in the panel right after on Wick's channel is that the Democratic depth chart is really strong. Like without Biden, there's a lot of good options. And there's like a really good debate as to what the best option of those would be. But I think if you compare the 2028 primary, which is going to be a competitive Democratic primary no matter what, to the 2020 primary, which was like nominally competitive in the sense that there were a lot of people running, there would be a stark difference, right? Because I think in 2028 you're gonna have a lot of governors, senators, members of the House, like very relevant current members of the Democratic Party run, and I think it'll be a very robust debate, and it'll be a good debate, right? And I think that whoever is able to win that primary is obviously probably going to be the strongest candidate. Yeah, I think it'll be. I really can't imagine in 2028. I mean, who knows? It could be someone crazy, right? Maybe we'll elect our own Trump. But I think that in 2028, I can't imagine the Democratic nominee being a bad nominee. It's hard to imagine that, right? But anything could happen. But
I think the only way it could be a bad nominee is if it's Vice President Harris. I think
she won't win the.
I think
the
that
nomination though.
Like, what do you mean?
I don't think she'd win if she ran in the primary.
I mean, being the outgoing vice president, if Biden wins this time around, and also with her support amongst African American voters, I mean, you could see her path to victory.
I could see it. I mean, in hypothetical Democratic polls, she does do well. But I don't know. I think it'll be like a Dan Quayle situation, right? Dan Quayle ran for president in 2000, and he got basically no momentum. To be fair, he was running against the president's that he served under his son. So that was obviously a bit of a different scenario. But I don't know. I just don't think Kamala, she has a real charisma problem, I think. And I think that whoever the biggest, if you had to pick like one single characteristic that you could like put the slider all the way to 10 on your RPG character, like your RPG politician, charisma is like probably the most important singular characteristic to winning an election, any election. And in terms of like personal characteristics, obviously your connections and your fundraising ability, that's one thing as well. And I think that that's what killed Ron DeSantis's campaign, was that it turns out he's not very charismatic. That's what, in some regards, is killing Biden's campaign. He doesn't appear to have much of an ability to be charismatic at this point. I just think that that's really that's what can kill a campaign. And I think that a lot of those other candidates, I think, have a lot of charisma, right? You know, you look at an AOC, Gretchen Whitmer, good personalities, good charisma, and I don't hate Kamala Harris, right? I think she was a solid VP pick. But yeah, I'd be surprised if she had much long tail in the Democratic primary. She didn't win the first time she won in the Democratic primary. She didn't do very well at all in the first Democratic primary that she ran in. And obviously she was running against Joe Biden, the current nominee, but anything can happen. Anyway, any last thoughts on that before we move on to our actual show topics for the day, Micah?
All I know is that Warnock needs to be a presidential or vice presidential candidate at some point. And I'm telling you, somebody needs to talk to Michelle. Maybe we can send in Barack. Okay. I don't know who can get to Michelle, but just tell her, listen, I know you spent a lot of time in the White House. What about another 8 years? What's another 8 years? Come on. Democracy needs you, Michelle. Come back.
Yeah, that's true. Because in 2028, no matter who wins this election, I'm sorry, that's actually not true. If Trump loses, Trump might run again in 2028. That'd be hilarious. But if Trump wins, obviously, then we would have the first like non-Donald Trump Republican primary in a decade. And so that'll be very interesting as well, because somebody was speculating that Ted Cruz would be the nominee. I'd be pretty surprised if that was the case, but that'll be quite an interesting primary, because Trump, even if he doesn't run, he's still very influential, right? So whoever gets his endorsement would obviously have a great advantage probably. But anyway, guys, all right. Let's move on to our main topic of the evening. So for those of you that don't know, in America, we fought this little old thing called the Revolution against the British back in the 1700s. We were a little upset about being taxed, having to pay all these tea taxes, tariffs, by the way. Just to be clear, we didn't really like tariffs so much back then. At least tariffs that we had to pay and had no representation. So we fought this revolution against the British. We ended up winning. We ended up splitting off. But Britain is still around. The UK is still a country, and they have elections just like we do. They have a bit of a different system, but they've been governed by conservatives for the last decade and a half. And by all accounts, and unironically, by like every single poll that you can look at, by the trends of things, by any metric analysis that's credible that you could look at, the Labour Party is going to win this election. The Labour Party is going to win. And so, given the fact that the Labour Party has been out of office for a decade and a half, but they're probably going to win, we figured a cool episode would be to go over their manifesto. One of the advantages of parliamentary systems, and call it like more institutionally like structured parties in an electoral system, is that when you have a parliamentary system, majoritarian system, and like a strong party system, the party manifesto is typically literally just what happens, right? You don't have as much of a problem where people campaign on things and then just don't do them, right? Because in America, like when Joe Biden campaigns on a public option, $15 minimum wage, there's all these excuses, either real or fake, that can happen. Oh, well, the parliamentarian won't let me do it, or the Republicans control the House, or the Supreme Court says it's illegal, or, you know, what, just all these different fucking bullshit excuses, or real excuses that happen as to why they can't get done. But when, you know, the Labour Party wins a majority in the parliament and they have a manifesto that says we're going to do these things, that's definitely what's going to happen, right? Like, it's a much more credible platform, at least, you know, by my read of things. And so what are the policies that are most likely going to be adopted in the UK in the next 5 years, right? That's the Labour manifesto. And so let's go over it today. Micah, any thoughts on the broader election before we get into the actual policy matter of things?
So I just sent you a poll to pull up for the stream. You know, the conservatives have really struggled recently. They've had a lot of disasters. They had Brexit, which is now extremely unpopular. I think it's about 70% of the public now thinks Brexit was a mistake. Boris Johnson was mild in scandals. And eventually we got Liz Truss for not a very long time, thankfully. Her premiership was a complete and total disaster. And they put up Rishi Sunak, which is like their last gasp, their last hope. And, you know, in these polls, wherever you pull them up, you can see that whenever Rishi Sunak becomes prime minister, there's a slight bump in the polls for Labour because it is hard to make a pitch that you are the right party for leadership whenever you can't even have a consistent leader. You keep replacing your leader constantly. They went through like 3 leaders within.
In the last decade and a half, they started out with David Cameron, then they went to Theresa May, then Boris Johnson, then Liz Truss for a brief 40 days, and then Rishi Sunak. So 5 different leaders in the last 14 years.
Right. Completely disastrous. And Rishi Sunak came out at a time whenever they were dealing with a lot of economic problems, in part because of Liz Truss's actions and poor leadership, but also in part because there's a global sequence of economic events which are harming all incumbents. It's hurting Biden, right? The UK had a stint of relatively high inflation because of the supply constraints in monetary policy and fiscal policy that caused inflation all over the world. They've struggled with energy prices because there's a war in Ukraine, which certainly has had a negative contribution in that regard. And these things have made things very difficult for them. And so we've seen that Labor actually is doing all right. They don't have over 50% support of the public. But in large part, the conservatives have just lost trust. And also, the Reform Party, the more radical right-wing party, has gained support. And they've gained support because conservative voters are dissatisfied with how conservative the Conservative Party is. They want something more right-wing, more extreme, more anti-immigrant. And so because they have a first-past-the-post voting system, there's a lot of vote splitting. In a recent poll, and I don't think it's shown here, it actually showed that the Reform Party or Reform UK was polling evenly with the Conservatives. It was like 16% and 16%. And if the Reform UK does do that well, it will mean that the Conservatives get completely and totally obliterated. But it wouldn't be because Labor was extraordinarily popular. It would be because a lot of the population has become militantly right-wing.
Yeah, and to be fair, Reform, like these like Brexit focused like Eurosceptic parties, they've pulled a lot from Labor as well. I mean, you can see that, you can see that in what do you call it? You can see that like as Reform rises, Labor loses a chunk as well. Like for instance, one interesting election result in 2019, I believe it was I think it was when it was the Brexit Party instead of Reform Party, but it's essentially the same group of people. Ed Miliband, who used to be the Labour Party leader, he actually very nearly lost his seat. This is an incredibly safe Labour seat, but he very nearly lost because the Brexit candidate was able to pull like 30% of the vote or something. A lot of that came from Labour as well. But what's almost certainly the case is that they pull more from Conservatives than they do from Labor. And so, like Micah said, because of first past the post, although it's a parliamentary system, it's also a multi-party democracy system. And they have relatively, I think one of the reasons why multi-parties do well, even though it's a first past the post system, the districts in the UK are very small. So, I mean, it's not unusual to have like 50,000 voters in these elections. Whereas like if you compare that to a US House seat, we might have 200,000-300,000 people vote in a U.S. House election. It's just not totally unusual to win if the reach out that you have to do is super duper low, and there's like almost no money in politics in the UK. There's money in politics, of course, but they spend, I don't know, they spend a 1/100th of what Americans do on their elections, and so those two things combined mean that small parties can do a lot better in the UK. And so you don't
And,
have this filtering effect over time.
right. And one other thing we should note is that there still is a majority for the left of center in the UK. The vote splitting has just historically hurted the Labour Party more than the Conservatives because, I mean, if you look at these polls, the Greens are at like 6%. Almost every Green voter, if the Green Party wasn't around, would be voting for Labour, right?
Yeah.
Similarly, the Lib Dems are actually to the left of Labour on many issues. They're certainly much closer to Labour than they are to the Conservatives. That's why they're actually kind of making a informal alliance right now, not to compete against each other. But most of their vote comes out of the Labour Party as well. And the SNP, if it didn't exist, I assume the vast majority of its voters would go to Labour. So the vote splitting is finally just not being as disadvantageous to the left as it usually is. Yet another reason why First Past the Post is just a really terrible voting system to be using anywhere.
Yeah, a lot of European countries have, more proportional systems. I mean, obviously, like MMP is very, very common right across the broader developed world. Germany has MMP. The Netherlands is a proportional representation system. It's not totally unusual. I think they have MMP in Sweden as well. If you look at countries like New Zealand, they have MMP. Australia, I don't believe has any sort of proportional representation, but they don't have first past the post voting in Australia.
They have a single transferable vote for their lower house. And they use, I think, just ranked choice voting for their upper house. I mean, in the UK, they would be helped a lot just by having runoffs. I mean, even as simple as having runoffs and approval voting in the first round would basically fix this entire problem. But they don't. Anyway,
unfortunately,
why don't we talk about what the Labour Party wants to do?
That's the state of things as we see it as a couple of filthy Americans. And so what is the actual proposals that the Labour Party is running on, and what is actually going to happen in the UK? Micah, you were taking some notes before the show. Yes. What are some things that stood out to you in the future of the UK's governing policy as determined by Keir Starmer and the Labour government?
Right. So as a left of center show, we're all happy that the Labour Party is finally going to take the reins. God willing, if the polls
communism will prevail in the UK now.
Hopefully not that. But there's 5 main missions that they have. And I think these are really, really good priorities for a country, especially like that of the UK, to have. Number 1, it's to kickstart economic growth. This one I think is the most important of all 5 because the UK is not a rich country. If you compare the UK to America, it is a poor country. It is a particularly poor country when you exclude London, which certainly increases their average because so much of the economic output of the UK is just within the London metropolitan area.
Literally just London.
So that's for him. Yeah. Right. Number 2, it's making Britain a clean energy superpower. Not a bad idea. I would hope that includes nuclear. Number 3, taking back our streets. This is one of the campaign pieces of their platform that is clearly in there to try to appeal to the center. Taking back our streets is about crime. It's about combating crime. And what we've seen all over the world is that a pro-public safety, pro-tough on crime stance in our modern political environment is once again in vogue. People are not really woke on the public safety question. At least the majority of the public is not. And so they're taking that stance now. Number 4, breaking down barriers to opportunity. I really like this piece of their platform because that's exactly how I think that we should go about talking about a lot of harmful economic instruments like occupational licensing, like restrictionary forms of zoning, like an education system which is too slow and too expensive, barriers to the kind of opportunities we want people to have access to. And number 5, this is a classic. This is in every Labour platform, building an NHS fit for the future. The NHS stands for National Health Service, and it is the socialized healthcare provider of the United Kingdom. And by pretty much all accounts, it's not in good shape. And voters in the UK are eager for somebody who can improve it. So I'm thinking that we could talk about each one by one. What do you think about that?
Yeah, sure. I guess let's start as well with just so you've kind of given your general views. Obviously, like Micah said, we're going to generally be supportive of the Labor Manifesto. To some degree, we might think that they don't go far enough on certain things. Obviously, we might just flatly disagree with some things, but overall, certainly the atmosphere of this podcast is definitely probably time for a Labor government in the UK after 14 years of rule from the Conservatives. Overall, I mean, my biggest criticism of their platform, the Labor Party's platform, like I said, is I don't think they go far enough on a lot of things. One thing that I will say as well is I it's not necessarily that I disagree with this. It's just that I disagree in magnitude. We've had a lot of speculation, sort of conjecture, let's say, about this election where people said, well, for those of you that don't know, the leader of the Labor Party is Keir Starmer. He took over as leader of the Labor Party from Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn was a hardline socialist, right? He was like one of the most socialist leftist leaders of the Labor Party in a long time. The Labor Party was founded as a socialist, social democratic party like 100 years ago or something like that. And obviously they had socialist aspirations, but they've kind of, much like a lot of the socialist parties, they realized that for one reason or another, either their policies didn't work or it wasn't popular enough. So they reform into being essentially center left in a European context, socialist leaning parties where, yeah, they're more likely to advocate for state industry, but the idea of like totally socializing the economy, or perhaps like what we think of as true socialism, changes over time to fit more this like sort of welfare state regulatory model of private market interaction with obviously some more state enterprises and stuff than you probably imagine. However, when Jeremy Corbyn won, he really kind of brought back a lot of that old labor energy, right? Of like, we're going to have a lot of state-owned enterprises. We're going to have a lot of sort of collectivist institutions in general. We're going to greatly expand the welfare state. We're going to tax the shit out of rich people. He had like the idea of taxing everyone the top 5%, right? So not just the top 1% like in America gets talked about, but the top 5% of income earners, which is, I think if you looked at the percentiles, that's like basically people that make above six figures in the UK. And so six figures in British pounds, so I don't know, $125,000 American equivalent. And so yeah, Weird Black Cat, lots of push for co-ops too, exactly. So just collectivist institutions in general in Jeremy Corbyn's platform. And he ends up doing very well in the 2017 election in a relative sense. A lot of people thought he would get destroyed in the 2017 election, but the vote share of the Labor Party was actually historically high in that election. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to win. But in 2019, he ends up getting demolished, like unbelievably demolished in that election. And in response to that, the Labor Party elected a more centrist candidate, and they're doing very well in the polls. Now, that long preamble is to counter the idea that I've seen a lot, which is like, oh, the reason Labor is doing so well is because they elected this centrist guy. And it's like, guys, say what you want about Jeremy Corbyn. I for a number of reasons, I don't agree. I agree that he wasn't an optimal candidate, right? And if I had my just pick of who could run the Labor Party, probably wouldn't pick Jeremy Corbyn. However, if Jeremy Corbyn was the leader today, I don't know if the Labor Party would be doing much worse. We have to keep in mind all the context. Historical stagnation, Brexit, austerity, the NHS is dog shit, strike after strike after strike, global inflation that particularly hurt the UK. There's just not a lot of party dynamics here that I think are net favorable to the Conservatives. Like, it would be shocking if almost any Labor leader lost this election. And I'm sure that the centrist platform helps somewhat because there was a lot of stigma associated with Jeremy Corbyn, but I'd be generally surprised if you couldn't make this platform a lot more progressive and still end up winning. What do you think, Micah?
I think that I think it's a lot of people say that Jeremy Corbyn would actually be doing much better and that Keir Starmer has been a failure. And the fact that they're not leading by way more is a sign that kind of this center-left approach to politics is unsuccessful. I think that's just not based in data at all. I mean, we look at, and I'm looking at the polls. You can bring them back up, and we can go through the entire record here. Wasn't Jeremy Corbyn the leader of the Labor Party in 2015, or am I mistaken? Because I believe he was.
After 2015 is when he got elected, yeah.
After 20, because they had a horrible election result in 2015. They only had 31% support then.
Yeah, that was under Ed Miliband.
he was doing terrible in the polls the entire time until after Brexit. Right before, like around April, Labor was down at 26%, and they shot up just before the election to their highest point ever, which is still lower than what the Labor Party has now. And they lost that election to a terrible candidate, Boris Johnson. After, the Conservatives were not particularly doing fantastic at this point in time. And then there's a terrible, terrible 2019 election result. Yeah. And so I don't think the really hard line, I'm literally a socialist politics helps.
No, I'm not.
Joanne,
I think that cures. No, just to be clear, I'm not saying it does help, right? I'm just saying that I think people are too quick to say that a very centrist approach is necessarily electorally advantageous, when I think there's some min-maxing that we could do here, where there's probably more progressive policies that maybe are worse electorally, but are also better, that you could get away with. Like, for instance, some of the things that you'll talk about, like maybe going harder in on zoning and immigration, you could probably get away with that in such an environment like this, where, yeah, you might lose some margin of voters, but your margin is so high anyway that you can get away with it. You can enact some genuinely good policy. And also there's some progressive policies that would probably add to vote share that we could probably think of. But
no, I agree with that. I would just say that probably in the UK, I think that the more centrist approach has gained them a few points. And it would have gained them more points if there wasn't so much vote splitting. Because the more left-wing the Labour Party is, the worse the Green Party does. And so the less votes that are just lost. Now, if they were in more of a two-party dynamic like we have in America, I do think the center-left pivot would gain them more than just a few points. It'd be close to like 10 points. But that's not their situation. So I think that Keir Starmer is a much stronger Labour leader, but vote splitting reduces the amount of effectiveness that his pivot to the center can have.
Sure. And so our general views of this platform is going to certainly be net positive. And like Micah said, let's talk about some of the specifics. What do you have to start us out on the specifics, Micah?
So let's talk about platform plank number 1, the kickstarting economic growth. So this is super important. And one of the bullet points I have here is something that I know SDL would find very exciting. A national investment fund. Okay, that sounds similar to something social wealth fund. It's basically the same idea. They want to invest billions and billions of dollars in ports, supply chains, automotive gigafactories. Interesting. The steel industry, carbon capture development, and green hydrogen manufacturing. What do you think about that set of industries to invest billions of dollars in?
I think it's mostly positive. I mean, I think that, again, like, one of the things that we might have some disagreements on, it might be more marginal disagreements, is that I do think that there is some justification to protectionism, insofar as we think of protectionism as like domestic subsidies, right? I don't think the best way to do protectionism is tariffs. However, there's probably something to be said about having certain key sort of national security type or like social fabric, dependent industries that are just domestic, right? We don't live in ultimately the most perfectly stable utopian world of peace and prosperity. There's a reason why you have free flow of goods and services and people within countries and not necessarily without countries. And so I think that investing in certain key industries like steel or agricultural products, or like they talk about the automotive industry, ports, things like that, I mean, that's probably not a bad idea. And it's probably not terribly inefficient. What do you think?
So I like the idea of investments, promoting investment. And that's certainly something the UK needs. And I think public investment can do a lot to support economic growth. But I don't believe in domestic subsidies for specific industries, just generally. I think insofar that there's national security concerns about, for instance, the Chinese producing a very large percentage of important medicines. The solution to that is probably just tariffs and then opening up more trade with other allied countries on those specific resources. You don't need to onshore every single type of good that is of strategic importance. You just need to make sure it's not being produced in a country that you consider a geopolitical opponent.
I mean, I agree that deepening trade relationships with other countries is an important part of like a national security focused trade strategy. It's just that I'd imagine that there are just certain things that I think it just makes sense for every country to have a strong domestic production of. Like for instance, food. There are some countries that literally import like 80% of their food. That just seems very precarious, if you ask me. I think it's probably not a good structure in your economy. And I think that especially we saw this during COVID when all these trade restrictions got brought up, all these lockdowns happened, and you had a lot of countries that like were genuinely really, really fucked in terms of importing the food that they needed, right? And that's obviously really, really bad, considering that almost every country probably has the sort of geographic ability to make enough food that can at least sustain a reasonable calorie base for their population. Now, do we subsidize agriculture too much in certain countries, America specifically? Like probably, but I don't know. I mean, it seems like it's quite intuitive to me that you'd probably want to, like you'd probably want to have a lot of domestic investment and ownership of certain key industries. I mean, after all, like the TikTok ban is an example of that, where like, do we want to have like, a foreign government like potentially influencing the media diet of people in our country, right? Like maybe not, right? So.
Well, I think that's a bit different because that's the Chinese. I mean, if this is a company owned by Canada, I don't think we'd have much issue with them owning it.
Of course.
And I don't really think that Norway needs to be growing corn or rice. I don't think they need to be subsidizing the cattle farms in Norway. They get a lot of their agriculture, from my understanding, from France. And despite the fact that the far right's doing relatively well in France right now, I don't think that is a real concern for that they should be having. I think there's an opportunity cost for every public dollar of spending, and I think it's easy to say, well, it wouldn't be nice if we subsidized this and got this outcome out of it. We had slightly more domestic manufacturing of this kind of thing. Of course, that is the safest outcome if it's domestically manufactured. But every single dollar you spend on that is one that can't be spent on healthcare, can't be spent on education, can't be spent on tax cuts, can't be spent on public investment that has a high ROI. And so I think that, and you see this later in the platform, they want to make big investments in their infrastructure. I think that's a great idea. They want to make investments in capital funds which support like green industry. That's something that I think actually would make sense. That's not an onshoring operation.
That's most of what this is, right? Investing in
the steel industry. I don't think the steel industry needs to be.
Some of these things are going to
onshore.
Some of these things are political in nature, right? Where I don't. So, yeah, like for something like that, I'm not sure if it's reasonable to have like, oh, we have 80% market share of steel or something like this. But like something like, for instance, like the CHIPS Act that Joe Biden passed, which is in theory just going to establish some sort of minimal base of production of chips in America. It's not like we're trying to nationalize the whole industry and like every chip that we use is made in America. But, if you were to say, oh, hey, 15% of the total U.S. consumption of steel, maybe that's a reasonable target for U.S. domestic production. I mean, that seems pretty reasonable to me, just to have some sort of basic expertise and like base of experience. And if you did have a crazy situation like fucking World War III and you had to like quintuple the amount of steel that you're producing, having that sort of domestic capacity, I think makes some sense to me. Not to belabor the point, but we should probably move on.
I mean, clearly, in the case of chips, you could argue it's net positive because it'd be cataclysmic if we had any sort of conflict with China where we didn't have access to semiconductors or a lot of the semiconductors that we need. But there is a real question about huge subsidies for these industries, many of them inefficient, and they always are.
Huge subsidies are probably always bad.
and inefficiently organized in many ways. Subsidies that economists would say this actually doesn't have. There's not much of an elasticity to this. Is the most efficient way to go about this. Likely just more tariffs on Chinese semiconductors and working to expand supply chains resilience on the Western countryside, like a investment plan to produce that manufacturing capacity just within democratic Western countries would be much more efficient. But that's besides the point. There's other good stuff in here. Another one that I really like, which Jeremy Corbyn's Labor Party would have never done, is capping the corporate tax rate at a stable rate of 25% and retaining full expensing for capital investment. So let's talk about that a little bit. Now, initially when we read through this, me and you were like, why in the world would they cap the corporate tax rate at its current 25%? And their justification for this is that the corporate tax rate has changed very erratically under the conservatives. And that actually makes tax planning more difficult. And I think that's fair. I think stable tax rates is a good thing. And I also think it's very important that center-left and left of center people support full expensing. Full expensing is the ability for companies to deduct their investments in physical capital and often research and development. And so basically we're saying we're only going to tax your real profits, the money that you're giving to your shareholders. We're not going to tax your investments, because whenever you tax something, you get less of it. And if you tax investment, that means you're going to get less investment. And investment's very good for the economy. It's good for workers. And so I think it's really good that they've committed to not taking a super tax corporations like crazy stance.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, full expensing is just a much simpler way to also do your tax code, right? So forget about, like, one of the things that people have to keep in mind, I mean, we've talked about it a lot when we talk about the corporate tax and different ways to like improve our tax system. Full expensing is just one of those things that it's not just that it's better in the sense that it encourages investment, but it's also better in the sense that it's just like a way simpler way to collect your taxation, right? I mean, like we should try to organize our tax system such that we have a few axes that we care about. We care about the equitability of the tax code. We care about how efficient it is at raising revenue. But we should also care about how much deadweight loss that the tax code produces. And when people think about deadweight loss, the material way to think about deadweight loss is like all the tax consultants and all the tax accountants and all the tax lawyers that have to get hired at these businesses. Because in a profit maximizing firm, you're always going to be incentivized to pay as little amount of tax as possible. That's not totally unreasonable. It's not that the system of profit maximization is like necessarily always bad, or that we need to get rid of that fundamental system. But there's better and worse ways to collect taxes from these entities. And one of the advantages of a simple tax code is you just simply don't need to hire all these people in order to optimally like reduce the amount of taxes that you pay, or optimally structure and send out the correct payments of taxes you make. Because basically under full expensing, a stable rate of taxation, I mean, any dummy could look at, okay, well, here's our revenue, here's our costs, here's our investments, therefore here's the profit that we're taxed on, and there's the check to the government, right? Now, there's always going to be strategies to minimize your taxation, so you can't totally get rid of tax accountants, but there's certainly more or less efficient ways of organizing things in our system than we do now. And the UK having full expensing and continuing that is probably a good idea.
Right. Then we get to the best thing, the number one reason why, if you live in the UK, absolutely you should be voting for the Labour Party, and that is land use reform. Riveting. Okay. In the UK have these people, they're called NIMBYs, not in my backyard folks. They don't like it when stuff is built, whether that be housing, whether that be new manufacturing facilities, whether that be new businesses. They don't like development.
Whether that be renewable energy farms.
Right. And they use land use regulations to basically prohibit development. And this is a huge contributor to how expensive real estate is in the UK, how expensive housing is in the UK, and the economic stagnation of the UK, because development is economic activity. And development not only is economic activity itself, but it allows future economic activity, more efficient housing of people, right, closer to where they want to live, more businesses, more manufacturing. And so this has been a huge problem they've been struggling with. And in the UK, Labour Party has made a key part of their platform, really taking a national strategy to reduce these restrictions.
Yeah, I think that one thing that people have to keep in mind, the reason why NIMBYs are so bad, and when we talk about a decade and a half of economic stagnation, it's really true. Like, look at the economic growth rate of the UK. Look at the wage growth rates of the UK. They're really, really low. right? If present at all. And one of the reasons why that's certainly probably happening is all these land use restrictions. Like Micah said, NIMBYs are bad not just because they prevent just affordable housing from getting built, they prevent all sorts of different investments from happening. And a lot of the justifications are just stupid, right? You know, some people will say, "Oh my goodness, if we get rid of these land use restrictions, there's going to be no environment left. The environment's going to be gone. No more trees, no more grass, no more green spaces." Where the fuck has this happened? Okay, where has this happened? Look at Japan. Japan has incredibly YIMBY institutions in terms of how they build and manufacture things, or how they build and build manufacturing plants and things like this. It's not like Japan has no environment or beautiful landscapes or places to visit that are untouched by man's evil domestic manufacturing hands, right? Like, this just doesn't happen, right? There's just this, to some degree, I don't know how genuine it is in the NIMBY movement that they actually think this is going to happen, or if it's just some weird other reason, like a lot of NIMBYs are just racist and they just don't want affordable housing because brown people will move into their neighborhoods. That's a huge portion of NIMBYs as well. But in the UK, you just find a lot of these justifications where, yeah, we just can't build anything ever, but then we're going to complain about why our productivity is stagnating. Then we're going to complain about why our wages are stagnating. Then we're going to complain about how, our economic position in the world is not as relevant because our economic growth overall is stagnating. It's like, well, guys, when you can't fucking build anything without some British guy in a fucking on a fucking sheep farm can decide that anything within 100-kilometer fucking radius is just illegal to build, that's why nothing is getting built and you can't produce more economic things. Guess what GDP is? It's basically the quantity of goods and services being produced at a certain price. When you can't build any new factories, when you can't build any new homes, the quantity of that shit is staying the same. So your economic position stays relatively stagnant. And that's what's happened in the UK over the last decade and a half.
Right. And it's and you run into these people all the time. They don't want things to stay the same, but they also don't want things to change at all.
Yeah, they're like the meme of like, we want no immigration, no building anywhere near me, and we also don't want any raise in taxes, and we also want all of our government services to be fully funded, and we want a robust welfare state and no crime. And it's like, guys, you can't have all these things at once. You can't have all of them at once.
We're tired of all these dilapidated buildings, but we don't want you to build new ones, okay? Don't build those. We're tired of all the traffic, but no new infrastructure. I mean, obviously it's ridiculous, but I'm glad they're taking a stance against it. Now, something that we should acknowledge is I read through their land use reform package, and they do talk about retaining green belts. Now, in the UK, they basically require that once there's certain strips of land outside along the perimeter of a city that must be kept as green space. And this is supposed to kind of restrain sprawl. But in many ways, this is a policy that is anti-development. And it could just lead to a lot of inefficiencies where new development, suburban-ish development still pops up, but just past the green belt, which is probably even worse. Because that's even more commute times. You get things that are even more spread out. So they have paid lip service to retaining green belts, and they've attacked the Tories for destroying the green space and replacing it with, development. So I don't know the extent of their YIMBY convictions. It does seem clear that they're the most YIMBY party in the UK right now that has a real chance. The Economist, I believe, they released an article not that long ago which talked about the YIMBY coalition within the Labour Party. So at least on that issue, they seem to be on the winning side most of the time. Now, here's something they've had on the platform for a long time, which is nationalizing their rail and Royal Mail systems. These are things that were privatized by the Conservatives. Some of them were, these might have been, at least one of these might be, have been privatized under Margaret Thatcher. In the UK, their rail system is not their pride anymore. They privatized it because the service, I think the justification is the service wasn't great. There wasn't very much innovation. There wasn't enough investment. And now they have tons of competing rail companies on tracks that I think are also privately owned, but owned by different firms. This is a different kind of rail privatization you have in countries like Japan. In Japan, there is private rail firms, but they're basically monopolies. They control the rail and they control the trains on the rail. And the idea is that this is called vertical integration. And many people have said this is a better model of privatization because it allows, trains and tracks are very connected to the quality of your service. And so if a firm controls both at the same time, they're able to upgrade the speeds and they have potentially better incentives for operating a high quality line. Meanwhile, the current system requires that the train companies raise all their revenue through fares. See, in Japan, because the rail companies are big landowners, they don't need to raise all of their revenue through fares. They're able to lease out their properties near their train stations for a huge profit. And so on net, the operation of the rail line yields them revenue because there's this effect on nearby land values they're able to capture. Which allows them to basically go without an enormous amount of government subsidies. In the UK, meanwhile, because they have this business model, these private rail companies rely on a tremendous amount of government subsidies, which is one of the reasons why the Labour Party thinks they should be nationalized.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons also it was privatized that you didn't mention, Micah, in Understanding Economics in his BreadTube versus Economics. I think it was the part 2 video, maybe it was part 3. He actually talks about a lot of the structures of how the rail system in the UK works, and one of the reasons he mentions as to why it was privatized was, and it's in part why actually he, from a socialist perspective, is skeptical of renationalization, is there was just a lot of labor action in association with the publicly owned rail companies, and this created a lot of controversy because although strikes amongst private companies can sometimes be controversial because of supply chain issues and maybe the people striking are working at like a very key industry, even though the industry is privately owned and operated. It's more controversial just inherently when it's a public sector employee union who's striking, because that's everyone's problem, right? It's like this is a publicly owned company, right? And so this is kind of something that the government like necessarily has to take more seriously, because it's not the responsibility of some private corporation and some private union to reconcile their issues. Well, now it's the responsibility of the government and the government sort of employee union to respond to these issues. And there was just a lot of labor actions that caused people to be kind of annoyed with the public employees of the rail union, and so that's why in part there was this political desire to privatize the railways. And so we'll see. Obviously, that doesn't appear to be a very relevant piece of the discussion in terms of renationalization. It's also not a particularly it's just not very controversial, I guess. Like, it doesn't seem like in the UK the Labour Party gets a lot of flack for saying we want to nationalize the rail system. Like in America, I feel like if Joe Biden said he wanted to nationalize the rail system, or if he wanted Joe Biden's like, every utility should be publicly owned. If he said something like that, that would be pretty controversial, I think. I think a lot of people would talk about it consistently. It would just be like a week of bad news. But in the UK, it's just not quite so controversial. And so I don't think that Labour's going to get a heap of shit for doing this. And I don't know, it probably wouldn't result in the worst outcomes overall. So.
If you ask me, I really do think the Japanese model is the best. I think Japan has the best high-speed rail in the world. I do think that public ownership of rail doesn't have the worst track record of public ownership out of any industry. It seems like some European rail services are publicly owned and they do rather okay, but it doesn't seem like it has really the best track record either. I don't think you would see some sort of tremendous improvements in the quality of rail in the UK unless there was a huge national investment plan for rail, and in that case, it would probably have a very similar impact with keeping the privatization. It would just be a question of public resources. So I don't, it's not a terrible, awful, destroy the country idea. I don't think it's a particularly amazing idea. They also want to consider renationalizing Royal Mail. Now this one is.
Micah
I'm more
hates the
skeptical of.
USPS. He's the least
But
fan of the USPS.
this is the one I'm more skeptical because I just think it's very important that whenever we want to do something, especially that costs the public money, you really want to have a strong empirical basis for it. And from my understanding, and people can correct me if I'm wrong here, the studies I've seen on the privatization of Royal Mail has not suggested that it made things worse. I've heard anecdotes that it made things worse, but just around the world, privatizations of mail services seem to have improved efficiencies, at least according to the economic literature, meta-analyses. So if somebody could show me that, in fact, that's not the case, in fact, it makes things worse, it made things much worse, then go ahead. I don't think it's the end of the world either. I think USPS is, fine. It's not like it's a terribly run organization, although the biggest problem with USPS is it's very bad at making money, just like Amtrak. Despite the fact that it has monopoly rights that are worth, I believe, over $10 billion, at least many billions of dollars. Now, we've talked about this before, and you made a really good point last time we talked about this. They also have requirements that cost them money, right? Like the USPS is required to provide mail service to every zip code in this country, and they're required not to discriminate in terms of how much they charge for every zip code in this country. So that costs money, and maybe that is not fully compensated for in terms of the monopoly rights that are granted. I'm skeptical of that, but it's certainly possible.
Well, I think the biggest argument for privatization of mail service, just in general, whether it's in the U.S. or any other country that has a national, sort of mail service option, is it's not really I don't even think it's the fact that, these are unprofitable industries. I think it's the trivialization of mail as a service because of technology, right? I mean, how many people are sending letters nowadays? How much stuff do you really have to get by physical mail nowadays, right? To a large degree, the USPS is just like another shipping company, right? It's just like FedEx that also happens to deliver like letters basically to people, mail to people. So to the extent that the USPS has become more like a shipping company, the strongest argument for getting rid of it is, well, if it's just mostly a shipping company, why do we need like a publicly owned FedEx? Why do we need a publicly owned Amazon? Why do we need like a publicly owned UPS, right? I mean, why can't we just have private companies do this? I think that's probably the strongest argument, is basically, is it even a value to have mail service anymore, right? Can't we just do everything through email or, through government accounts or something like this? Like, why do we need like physically transported mail at this point? It's kind of a boomer thing if you think about it nowadays, but I don't know. I think, again, this is one of those things that I just think it's probably just doesn't have a very big impact either way. Like whether we have, really quick, I'll address what Vor says in the chat. Urbanite take, all these people in rural households, they just need mail service. It's like, dude, I'm pretty sure in rural households, they have internet. And they can use email in rural households. Like, I just don't think that that's a great argument.
If they don't, that is a huge problem that we absolutely need to
solve.
I
mean, it's like, well, if rural people don't have access to technology like urban people, then the problem isn't like, we shouldn't say, we need to support USPS perpetually because rural people have less access to technology. We need to address the access to technology. And then maybe there's more of an argument for getting rid of the USPS as a public service. Now, I'm not for getting rid of the USPS. I think it's a good public service. And even if USPS didn't have the monopoly on mail that it does now, then I think there's probably still some argument for keeping the USPS around. Like, overall, I'm just a lot more in favor of state-owned enterprises than Micah is. But the arguments from like a structural perspective of privatized mail service versus public mail service aren't like totally illegitimate. Like, it's reasonable that you would want a private mail service. And what I will say as well is that the reason why I'm not like particularly upset or excited about this policy is because, like, guys, I just don't think it makes that big of a difference in the grand scheme of things. Like, whether or not the UK has a public mail or a private mail option, like, that's not the big mover and shaker. The big thing on this platform is the land use reform. It's going to be the taxation changes. It's going to be the investment in all these key industries. It's just not going to be whether or not the equity of it's not going to be whether or not the state has an equity interest in a public mail service. Like, it's just not going to be a big mover and shaker for the quality of life of the average British person.
Based on the language and the platform, it doesn't seem like this is going to be anywhere near the top of the list.
Yeah.
I don't think they're really particularly eager to do this. And frankly, if you're in the UK right now and you have billions and millions of dollars you're sitting on, the first thing you're going to do is probably make some of these really important investments, like the NHS, in growing your economy, and not just changing who owns assets in a way that doesn't, really affect the quality of service that much. Okay.
The rest of these things are pretty small, so we can kind of blast through them. Yeah. Go for it.
Supporting co-ops by increasing access to finance. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that specifically means. It doesn't sound like the worst thing in the world. Changing procurement rules to benefit small and medium-sized businesses. I'm against this. And the reason why I'm against this is
Micah
if it
hates
means
small businesses.
I think government procurement should be like procurement for any business, which is get the best quality thing for the best price. And I think that if you want to help small businesses, or you want to help any specific community, you don't do that through procurement. You do that through an actual policy. I think trying to make procurement, solve climate change and solve inequities amongst every group and solve inequality and help the small businesses is just a really inefficient way to do government contracts. And it's a really ineffective way to solve those problems.
Yeah, I think overall, I mean, that's probably right. I mean, I think that generally speaking, there's almost always going to be a better way to support the communities that you want to support, the institutions that you want to support. So, like, for instance, one of the ways that the U.S. government enacts protectionism and also enacts like pro-union policies is they say, well, if you're a union shop, you get additional points on our like scoring criteria for government contracts, right? And it's the same thing if you source a lot of your materials from American, from American sources, essentially, right? More of a domestically manufactured product, right? And so, you're more likely to get government contracts in that regard. But the problem with all of that is that, again, if you think that more things should be made in America, the most efficient way to do that, at least in a relative sense, is going to be some sort of domestic subsidy, tax advantage, generally for an industry, something like that. But for government procurement, you probably want your government to just pick the most efficient, best product, right? Not necessarily whatever, like the product that we think has the most equity associated with it. And same thing with unions. If you want the government to create more unions or to encourage unionization, notice we had a whole episode on how governments can most efficiently sort of enable union origination. None of the things that any of us suggested were the government should basically just buy union products, right? There's just, number one, it doesn't make that big of a difference, right? If you think you're going to solve racial inequalities or wealth inequalities or income inequalities or labor power inequalities through the government buying certain products over others, that's not going to be the aggregate thing that makes that big of a difference. The big movers and shakers in that regard are going to be state capacity. They're going to be your tax code. They're going to be your welfare system. They're going to be your actual labor regulations, right? I mean, like, obviously reforming the NLRB is going to make a much bigger difference in terms of whether or not unions form than the government buying certain products from union shops, right? And obviously the thing that's going to address like racial inequalities is not going to be buying from like black-owned or woman-owned businesses, but it's going to be reforming our education system, increasing subsidies for that, raising taxes, which is necessarily sort of, equalizes racial and gendered inequities in society, and expanding your welfare state. Those are going to be the big things that address those things, not government procurement policies. And same thing with small and large businesses. I don't really know in general. I feel like not neoliberals, bad word. Liberals in general, center-left liberals, are not necessarily as in favor of subsidizing small and medium businesses, even intrinsically, because obviously there's economies to scale. It's not necessarily the case that you'd want to have like a bunch of small businesses if you could just have larger businesses do it more efficiently. And that's another reason why maybe this policy doesn't make as much sense. So.
Yeah, I believe in a level playing field and abundant opportunity. And I think that helps small businesses a ton, right? Social safety net helps people take risks. Unrigging the game, at Amazon, where they promote their own products above other products. That's the kind of way that you help other businesses in this economy, by giving them a leg up, but not by giving them an unfair advantage. Now, we have a couple more here. They want to cut immigration like everybody in the UK does. Lame, really lame. They want to restore the National Career Service. I I don't know. I don't know if private career services are bad. I don't know what that is particularly. They want to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. I think they should raise the minimum wage to 45% or 50% of the median wage, the KITES index. That is around the area where economists, a lot of economists at least agree, is the unproblematic territory. The most bullish on the minimum wage economist, Aaron Dubé, I always forget this. He says it should be 60% of the median wage. I'm not as bullish as him. He always produces the most pro minimum wage figures. There's plenty of people who produce worse figures for the minimum wage. And so I like to take the more conservative approach, which is 40 or 50% of the median wage and localized, the local minimum wage. If you have the national median wage, obviously London's going to, be contributing to that a lot. So you might be in an area where the average income is like, if you set the minimum wage at 50% of the national median wage, it actually might be 80% of above 80%, right? Or 80% of the median wage in a specific geographic region, which seems like that would be problematic for employment. So I don't know how how this policy translates to that standard. Hopefully it does. I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical that's actually the case, but hopefully it's not too bad.
Yeah, D. Hurley in chat says something really stupid. He says, these are two neoliberals. Every aspect of society and life is there to make money. So I think maybe you came in late, or maybe you have no familiarity with our broader, policies that we advocate for. I think I just said like 10 minutes ago that I'm in favor of a lot of state-owned enterprises, right? A lot of state-owned enterprises are sort of, some of them are for-profit, obviously, but I'm also in favor of a lot of government services, right? So I don't blame you if you came in later to the podcast, but probably don't say stupid shit without an understanding of like what our broader
getting roasted,
policy
roasting the chat out here.
Well, I think that unfortunately a lot of people will hear, certain things are better privatized, or like your tax system can be made in a certain way that's more efficient. And a lot of really dumb idiots out there will say, well, that's just neoliberalism. It's like neoliberalism isn't like when you do good tax policy, right? And like socialism isn't when taxes are inefficiently organized, right? So it's kind of a weird dynamic, if you ask me.
I think they just confuse like economic consideration for neoliberalism. Now, fortunately, you can think about things from an economic lens and try to do smart economic policy without being neoliberal. I mean, if you think smart economic policy is always just a neoliberal thing, then I guess you're just owning yourself if you're not a neoliberal.
We can talk about the next thing. We can talk about make Britain a clean energy superpower, right, Mike? Is that the next? That
is the next one. Frankly, I don't know exactly what this means. I assume it's just I'm reading through this, and I'm assuming it's just throwing a bunch of money at renewable energy. Now, something I will say is there's a huge difference in the ways that you can subsidize renewable energy. You could do production tax credits or production subsidies. So we just basically give you a certain allotment from the government for every gigawatt of energy that you produce using solar power. I don't think this is a very efficient way. I think it's more administratively complex. And a lot of those subsidies just go to manufacturing, which was already occurring before the subsidy existed, right? I think the most efficient way to subsidize renewable energy is just through making capital more accessible, low interest loans, right? A green investment bank. All of that money, all of those subsidies only go to newly produced green energy providers. So it's more efficient in terms of cost. It's also administratively simpler because making loans and reviewing loan applications is not that hard. And the subsidies baked into the interest. You don't need to have this complex application process. Did you really produce this much energy? Was this really what about the margins? Does this count as a renewable or clean energy source? Right. And so I think that's the better way to do subsidies. I also think that carbon pricing is the best approach to this. And it doesn't seem like that's here anywhere, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, one thing that the UK Labour Party proposed, Micah mentioned it a little bit, was a new state-owned enterprise, my favorite, where they're taking the approach of basically creating a state-owned enterprise and capitalizing that with some few $1 billion of like initial starting capital, and then the task of this green investment bank is basically just going to be to look at different assorted green energy project proposals and then invest in those projects insofar as they're socially and economically advantageous, of course. And this is good, of course. This is a good thing. I mean, the U.S. should have, every country should have a green investment bank with this purpose, with various levels of capital, of course. Just I guess depending on how big the country is. Because Mike is right. It's just a good way to not only socialize some of the gains of the business, the business activity associated with renewable energy growth and things like this, but it's also a way to just spur additional investment in renewable energy. And it's this bank. I mean, it would be run just like any other investment bank, which is if you propose a project that's like totally underwater and makes literally zero economic sense and just like destroys the local economy that you're you're building in, then it's not going to get invested in. Luckily for people that believe in renewables are amongst the cheapest forms of power, right? So it's not as if there's a incongruity between the ability to make money on renewables and also the social purpose of renewables. You can kind of accomplish both at the same time. So that's
unfortunately,
probably
I
a
don't.
good thing.
But there is a mention of nuclear in here. I was about to. Let me read this. Labor will end a decade of dithering that has seen the conservatives duck decisions on nuclear power. We will ensure the long-term security of the sector, extending the lifetime of existing plants, and we will get Hinkley Point C over the line. New nuclear power stations such as Sizewell C and small modular reactors will play an important role in helping the UK achieve energy security and clean power while securing thousands of good skilled jobs. Based. I think you need nuclear power. Now, there's a question of the cost of its production, just because building facilities has become so expensive. But I don't think this is an inherent element of nuclear. I think it is just a feature of our current heavy regulatory approach to nuclear and our lack of nuclear construction over the past couple of decades in most European countries, which just decimated our ability to efficiently do these really large scale projects. And that's something that we have to solve for all big infrastructure projects and all big sectoral transitions. So I think it's good they're supporting nuclear. I think nuclear is an important base load contributor to the energy system. Whenever the skies are cloudy and the wind's not blowing, you need something to keep the lights on. And batteries are expensive. And so batteries are expensive. Carbon emitting energy sources are harmful for the environment. And so nuclear is what you're left with. I'm glad that's in there. That's pretty much it for the making Britain a clean energy superpower. Number 3 is take back our streets, combating crime. And in here they have some relatively okay stuff. They have neighborhood policing. I really do think neighborhood policing is great. I work for the county. I just went to a meeting in one of the neighborhoods that's touted as having the highest homicide rate, one of the highest homicide rates in the country. And I spoke with a bunch of community members, and they talked about how great it was whenever we used to have community policing in this neighborhood. People knew who the police officers were. There was less occurrences of police officers engaging in what we consider police brutality or preemptive violence, because they knew, who the people were. They knew when Johnny was having a proverbial bad day, right? And when somebody was actually a threat. So I think that's good. Although it is a bit of the slogan. I feel like everybody's been for community policing for a long time. And despite the fact we still have a lot of actual violence. So there's a real question about whether community policing is actually going to be articulated.
Yeah, I mean, Keir Starmer used to be a prosecutor. He was part of some prosecutorial body in the UK for a long time before he was made a member of Parliament. He's sort of selected on a Labour Party list for Parliament. Interestingly, I don't think Keir Starmer's actually been in Parliament for that long. I want to say he got first elected in 2017, maybe 2015. Like, I don't think it's been that long. If I Google Keir Starmer real quick, but he's sort of risen the ranks quite quickly. I guess when you're part of the sort of public prosecution service, that's a big boon to your potential political career. But Yeah, all the stuff on crime is probably going to be, I mean, I'd imagine fairly marginal in nature. The truth is, I'm not sure if crime is a huge, even a huge problem in the UK. Like, I think that one thing that's interesting about Americans is Americans will oftentimes they'll look at other countries and like certain like crime waves or crime events that happen in other countries, and they'll say, "Oh my goodness, those places are so dangerous." But without realizing that America has like some of the highest levels of crime amongst any country in the developed world, right? Like it's unbelievable how high the amount of crime is in America, and especially violent crime, right? It's like America's actually a relatively unsafe place compared to many, many other developed countries. Especially, I mean, if you were to compare us to a country like Japan, Japan is like a utopian peace, loving, crime-free society compared to America. My goodness. But yeah, overall, I think it's a pretty good proposal.
Yeah, so there's that. There's also tougher penalties for certain kinds of crimes. We've talked about how usually that's just a bad idea. Criminals don't think, hey, whenever I get caught for this, am I going to serve 10 or 20 years in jail? They usually think I'm not going to get caught. And, trying to lock up people for the maximum amount of time is usually just an inappropriate approach. We really should be trying to have a rehabilitative justice system. Now, of course, certain people do need to spend life in prison because they are always going to be a threat to others. But many people do not fall in that category. And we've seen countries like those in Scandinavia be very effective at taking people that have committed heinous crimes and rehabilitating them and putting them back in society with a very low reoffense rate. And so I think that's probably a bad orientation, a very popular one in this era of this really tough on crime kind of approach. But there's a real question about whether it's good policy.
Yep, I would agree with that. All right, what's the next part, Micah?
Banning the carry of knives by teenagers. Well, at least it's a bunch of restrictions on knives. So in the UK, they don't have mass shootings; they have mass knifings, which is almost comical to us in America. That even the idea of that happening.
Mass knifings, not as bad as mass shootings, mind you.
Certainly not as lethal. They want to ban ninja swords and lethal zombie style blades. I don't know what that is.
I've never heard of a zombie blade.
Banning ninja swords, that sounds a little draconian. As an American, I mean, I just can't imagine that idea. I think really everybody should have the right to own a ninja sword.
Hard to say that ninja swords, can't imagine that's that big of a deal in the UK, but we're Americans, so what do we know about the ninja sword problem in the UK?
But what about other kinds of swords? Like ninja swords especially bad? Or did they already ban all the non-ninja swords and like the ninja swords were just cool enough to avoid?
Like, well, we banned claymores and we banned long swords and we've banned all these. Ninja swords somehow fell through the gaps of our regulatory state.
And like, I just wonder, are we going to have mass spear attacks?
Yeah, like I don't know. No, it's a great. I mean, look, who knows? Maybe people are gonna start walking around with cleavers and stuff. I mean, there's. How can you look? Here's the problem with knife regulation, British people. People are just gonna find a way to get around it, and they're just gonna pick a different knife to use. So what's the point of having any knife regulation, guys? That's really what we're trying to say.
Banning pointy sticks. That's what's next.
Exactly.
Oh my goodness.
You file your nails a little too sharply, and the British police and their funny hats are going to come put you in prison. That's kind of what I support, if you ask me. But
right. So another element of their agenda is really trying to crack down on domestic abuse, and I think this is a part of crime.
Oh no, Micah's internet. If Micah's internet fails, it's just going to be me. No, we can't hear you, Micah. Your mic is not working now. But yeah, I mean, the stuff on all the stuff on crime, keep in mind is not going to be like an incredible problem. Yeah, go on, Micah. Your camera's off now.
Okay.
There you go.
That was crazy. I don't know what happened. The big knife got to me. So that one big element of their platform here, and this is something I actually agree with, is really trying to crack down on domestic abuse. They want specialist rape units. They want to increase the amount of time law enforcement dedicates to pursuing domestic abuse cases. And this is a part of crime which seems to be really stable and high over time. There's just so many cases in which there are family members that rape the young women and boys within their family, or there's so much domestic violence attacking, loved ones, beating and hitting. So this is a huge problem, and it seems good to me that they're trying to dedicate more law enforcement resources to trying to solve it.
Of course, yeah, for sure. And then the last thing you have here,
there's two more: breaking down barriers to opportunity. Basically, more teachers, more primary school based nurseries. Okay, free breakfast clubs in every primary school. Nice. A modern curriculum. I don't know what that means. And more specialists and technical colleges.
I assume
Sounds
the modern
good.
curriculum is the woke propaganda will be implemented in the UK. That's my assumption.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure it was something like that. Yeah, that seems fine. Then there's building an NHS fit for the future. This is the one that I think they're really the most trusted on. I think the left of center parties in almost every country win on education and healthcare. And in the UK, healthcare is such a big one because the government is the provider of healthcare.
You want a government service and you want it to be run right, you elect people on the left. All right, that's a goddamn fact.
Don't elect the people which would have never proposed that system ever. And who are forced by politics to pretend like they like it, but everybody knows they do not like it. So their proposal is to cut NHS waiting times with 40,000 more appointments every week. And that's presumably just because of way more staff. And that is really important. There's way too much wait times in the UK. And to a large extent, it's just a funding problem. The UK spends a much lower percentage of its national income on healthcare than the United States does, and then many other European countries do, such as Germany. And really just increasing funding would help a lot. They want to double the net.
I was going to say, like, obviously one thing about the NHS is that it's very, it's cost efficient in a relative sense to like the American system. Obviously there are many aspects of the British system where they have cost savings, like structurally speaking. But one of the reasons why they spend so little on healthcare is because they just spend so little on healthcare, right? Like you probably need to spend more than they're currently spending on healthcare for a number of reasons. Now, to be fair, one thing that, a lack of economic growth and stagnation and wage stagnation means that your tax base for spending more on the NHS, especially when you have an aging population and a population with more robust healthcare needs, as healthcare gets better, tends to get a bit more expensive. And productivity stagnation, all these things, this is where that land use reform is intrinsically tied to every other policy. Right? If you have economic stagnation, wage stagnation, productivity stagnation, well, of course, it's going to be harder to spend on any government service, right? Especially something like the NHS. So, it all goes back to land use reform, guys. Henry George was right.
Right. Whenever you're in a country which has been having, a 1 to 2% growth and then, very negative growth during COVID, for a long time now. And it's not like your baseline is a super high GDP anyway. You need to grow. They have a high tax burden in the UK. And that's really the biggest takeaway, I think, from this platform is it looks like the Labour Party is doing what the left often does a bad job of, and that is focusing on growth. In a lot of countries in which taxes are already very high, you can't expand your social services just through more tax hikes. That's just going to be a bad approach. Focusing on a tax and spend approach might work in a place like America where there's not very much redistribution. But eventually, once you get into a certain level of tax burden, growth is really the only sustainable way to expand your social services. So they're going to hire a bunch of extra staff, new dentistry rescue plan, return of the family doctor, 8,500 additional mental health staff. This seems like exactly the kind of stuff they need to do. Now, there's a question about the actual administrative efficiency of the National Health Service. I can't comment too much on it, but what I would say is I do get concerned about socialized medicine's systems' ability to produce innovation. And I think really the way around this is to have a lot of public funding for research and development and innovation, and a real national strategy, a component of the system to be an arm that pushes innovations, the utilization of new technologies and the promotion of those innovations. But when the investment is not there, it will not occur. With a private healthcare system, with non-negotiated, no lack of price controls on drugs and new medical devices and new medical services, you can expect that basically you're going to have really high prices for these new medical innovations. And that is going to compensate the private companies for investing in that innovation. But if you have such a government control system with such stringent price controls, or in the UK, it's the government's the only buyer, so they're able to really negotiate prices down. You need the government funding for the innovation because the private funding simply is not there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's all completely correct. I mean, one of the most important things, if you're going to have any government service, any state-owned enterprise, one of the most important things, and if you feel like in your political environment, the best argument that Micah makes against state-owned enterprises and government services is the political environment, at least in America, is such that we have like a systemic idea that basically government services and programs are bad. So a lot of times they're underfunded, and because they're underfunded, they're even worse than they otherwise would be, even if the literature that Micah espouses on government services and state-owned enterprises is completely correct. They're even worse when they're underfunded, right? You can imagine that, well, a well-funded state-owned enterprise, even if we could divine that state-owned enterprises are worse than private enterprises in a relative sense, well, a less well-funded state-owned enterprise is going to be worse than a more well-funded one. And same thing goes for government services. And so if the political will exists to have government services, then they obviously should be well-funded, right? Because otherwise you get in this toxic spiral, which America is totally in the grips of. The UK still believes in their government services for the most part. It's not so clear if they believe in funding them, but at the very least they believe in them. Whereas in America, we were deep in that toxic spiral of like, we hate government services because they suck, and so because they suck, we're going to cut their funding, and because we cut their funding, they suck even more, and because they suck even more, we hate them even more. And it's like, holy shit, guys, we need to jolt ourselves out of this toxic spiral. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to do that in America, but quite yet, let's say. But in the UK, certainly it seems like there's, the UK, Canada, these systems that, more, let's say, government service oriented healthcare models in general, they just need to fund their systems properly. And like Micah said, a lot of that is just capital investment, right? It's not necessarily just having a super expansive services. It's a matter of investing in the type of capital that they need to have the most efficient distribution and production of those services, right? They should have up-to-date computers and information technology and up-to-date vehicles for ambulances and up-to-date what do you call it, methodology and training of their employees, things like this, so that they can provide the most productive service possible. Because one of the reasons why fundamentally, I guess, like, why are there waiting lists, right? Because they're not able to productively serve everyone that needs the service, right? It's not just a matter of having not as many doctors as you need. It's a matter of those doctors and those support staff being able to extend the services that they offer to people in as efficient a way as possible. They just can't do that in the UK because they've had this underfunding over time. So.
Right. And so let's speed run the rest of this. They want more devolution, which is good. This is especially a great way to appease the independence movement in Scotland. Micah? The devolution is greater decentralization. So empowering local governments.
Yeah.
Right. Empowering local governments and also empowering the nations of Wales and Scotland that exist within the country of the United Kingdom to have more control, because they already have a certain degree of their own control, but giving them more is probably a good idea. It seems like the government of Wales has done a relatively good job, and so has the government of Scotland across many areas. And also there's a real public interest in Scotland for independence. And independence would be a really bad idea, especially considering that the UK is no longer in the European Union. So that would leave Scotland in this weird limbo where they're divorced from the UK, And they're not in the European Union. They'd have to make their own currency. They'd be cut off via trade with everybody. And it would take them certainly a long time to join the EU. So I think that would be practically disastrous. So this is a good way to reduce the risk of that happening. They also want people to be able to vote at 16. That seems fine. They want to reform the House of Lords, which is an undemocratic body that comes from the early days of capitalism, where you had really nobility, which shared power with, the people's house.
Yeah.
They want
16-year-olds voting is an interesting one. It seems to have really caught on in the left lexicon of many countries, including America. I mean, I think Nancy Pelosi has been in favor of 16-year-olds voting for quite a long time now. And she was obviously the Speaker of the House for a long time in America. I think there's a lot of merit to it. I mean, the idea that I think in general, when your political consciousness reasonably starts to begin is when you should probably be able to vote. And I think it's probably fair to say that a lot of 16-year-olds take politics pretty seriously. Obviously, a lot of them don't. But 16-year-olds voting doesn't seem like the worst thing in the world. What do you think about a policy like that?
It doesn't seem like a bad idea. Although I suppose my only problem with it is maybe just one of our philosophy regarding how rights work. I think it's weird to have so many different ages in which you gain rights. To have the 16 and then the 18 and then the 21. I would like it to be, maybe a little bit more standardized. I mean, even if it was just 16 is where you get your first phase of rights, 18 is where you get your next phase of rights, and then 20, it's 2-year increments. So there's like a really actual approach to this. It's not just kind of all over the place.
Quite arbitrary, yeah.
Well, at least there's like some sort of philosophy to this, where like we can have some sort of real justification for how this works instead of they're kind of like randomly strewn about the place, and people are like, oh, are you really an adult at 18 because you can't still do this, and this? So that's just I don't know. It's probably not a serious problem. They also have some foreign policy stuff. They're very pro-NATO, very pro-Ukraine, both quite important things. Now, I assume their stance on the Israel-Palestine conflict is a relatively moderate one of like, basically, hey, we support a ceasefire and the return of the hostages, right? Isn't that their stance?
Yeah, Keir Starmer's gotten some shit for his relatively moderate stance on Israel and Palestine, but he's made a concerted effort to try and rid the Labor Party of these accusations of anti-Semitism, and part of that, unfortunately, I think is probably being a little bit too quick triggered with deselecting candidates who are more critical of the Israeli government. But at the end of the day, look, he's going to be the prime minister. He's going to win this election. And so he's going to have a mandate for all of his policies, right? And that includes a very moderate stance on Israel and Palestine as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, there is a real question about how much the prime minister of the UK can actually do to influence the decisions of Israel. I think the United States is much more important. Of course, though, it is always good to have another, important country on the world stage advocating for the right thing, whatever that is. The Labor's fiscal plan. What is that? Let's see what their fiscal plan is. This is the really tough thing, and this is why Labor Party's, in part, why the Labor Party has talked about growth so much. The UK is not in a great spot. They're in a fiscal crunch, and the Tories, because of the governing party, isn't able to mince words about this. They have to make cuts. They have to make cuts, and they have to make tax hikes, and neither of those things are, popular, unsurprisingly. And so, I think their fiscal plan is just showing how they pay for all of the spending they want to do. Unsurprisingly, it doesn't really add up. It is optimistic. Journalists have pushed them on this. It only adds up if they get the growth, their optimistic growth target. So suffice it to say, probably not all of this stuff will happen. But hey, it's a party platform. You always promise the best you could do. You don't promise the most accurate thing that you could do because voters don't seem to reward honesty all that much.
Yeah, obviously. I mean, I don't. I guess to be fair as well, I'm not even sure necessarily how bad I don't really know how truly bad the fiscal state is in the UK. I mean, obviously they took out a lot of debt, just like almost every country did in response to the COVID shutdowns and all this stuff. But I think that one of the biggest problems in the UK, which is why I mean you could argue for even higher deficits, is just the generalized lack of investment in their economy. Like, if obviously I don't know how electorally popular this would be, but like from a policy sense, if the Labor Party just like took out a shitload of debt and the way that they financed all of their capital investments was just debt financed, right? I don't know if that would be even a terrible policy, right? I mean, because it seems like they really do just need a lot of investment. Like it's a structurally underinvested in economy, right? So if they just took out a bunch of debt and started building shit with it, that'd probably be pretty good for the UK economy. But we'll have to see what Labor actually ends up doing in this regard. But yeah, this is a lot of politicians will bullshit around the deficits that they call, oh, well, we have enough economic growth to pay for this. And a lot of times that's not really true. But to be fair, in the UK, it might actually be true, right? Like these investments are probably going to pay for themselves just because of how underinvested in the whole economy is. So,
Right.
yeah. All right.
Right.
Anything else
So,
to
yeah,
say
it's a
on
good
the
platform.
Labor Manifesto, Micah? It's a good platform. We like it. We like the Labor Party on this here podcast. If SDL was able to join us, then he would probably be agreeing with us on these things, probably with very little nuance. I don't think SDL is a huge fan of like the Green Party or the SNP or whatever in the UK. I mean, perhaps if you lived in Scotland, maybe you strategically vote for the SNP just to prevent a Conservative from winning. But the SNP in Scotland has like they have like a one-party state essentially right now in
Right.
Scotland.
And I think the Labour Party is really their biggest contender, which is nice. Like in Scottish elections, the risk isn't really there, especially considering that I think due to a recent Supreme Court ruling, Westminster has to basically affirm the right of Scotland to have a referendum on independence for it to happen, which looks like that's absolutely not going to occur. So the risk of voting for SNP is really small. They're just a social democratic party.
Like right now, even in the Scottish Parliament, I'm looking up the numbers right now. In the Scottish Parliament, right, the government is, and so they have 129 total seats. So a majority of 129 is 65, I guess it would be, right? So 65 seats to make a majority. The government is obviously just the 63 SNP members, and then the other members are 7 Greens, 22 Labor. Right? Liberal Democrats at 4. So you've already got like, what is that? Like 2/3, 75% of the Scottish Parliament are basically left-leaning parties. In some regards, you could argue, oh, the SNP is not truly left-leaning. There's some, big tent type ideology in the SNP, but it's an overwhelmingly progressive party.
They're not getting fascists anytime soon in power.
Yeah. And then the Conservatives are on 31 seats, which is, I mean, that's basically a quarter of the Parliament. So I mean, there's not much. Like Micah said, we love it when our options are the far left and the center left. That's great if those are our options. At least it's better than in America where we've got the center left and the fascists, right? So those are that's the unfortunate state of American politics. Scottish politics is in a much better state, relatively speaking. Although there's not many countries in a worse political environment than America, to be fair. But anyway, the Labor Party is obviously they're doing pretty well with this manifesto. Obviously they're doing well in the election. They're probably going to win, 350, 400 seats or something like that. It's going to be a pretty good election result, knock on wood. The election, the reason we had to talk about it this weekend, the election is very soon. It's on, I think, July 5th, if I'm not mistaken, July 4th. So it's coming up basically early this week. And so if you're British
exciting
out there, go out and vote for the Labor Party or vote for the leftmost, viable option in your individual district. Whatever you do, just don't vote for the Conservatives. For God's sakes, British people, don't vote for the Conservatives this one time and just see the benefits. Let Keir Starmer usher in the new wave of economic growth for the UK. Let Keir Starmer be the Ronald Reagan.
Labor.
Yeah,
okay, time for Labor's turn.
Keir Starmer can be the Ronald Reagan of the left in the UK if you just give him the opportunity.
Right.
But anything else you wanted to talk about before we go to our audience topic for the week?
That's all for this one. Great. Here, let me move my camera. I actually have my laptop down here.
He's
I
moving his
think
camera, ladies and gentlemen, before
I
we talk about
think
the audience topic.
right. I think I have my camera like super highly placed because I have this monitor riser I made. I think this is better.
There you go.
Hopefully.
Accentuates the neck a little bit more. All right. Let's do it. All right. Surprisingly, I was actually surprised that the audience picked this topic for us to talk to. So again, patreon.com/the3wonks. Become a member if you want to say in what we talk about on a week-to-week basis. The audience topic for this week that was voted on by the Patreon members was Trump's tax plan. So Trump recently, he made this sort of offhanded comment about replacing the income tax with tariffs, essentially getting rid of the income tax, all the revenue that we raise, and replacing it with tariffs. I don't know how much needs to be said about this. We've talked about tariffs a lot on our podcast before, but certainly this is a much more bombastic idea of replacing the income tax with tariffs. Now, some context for this is that Trump has already he's currently running on a platform explicitly of universal tariffs. So he says everything we import, 10%. I think he's used figures like that before. We're going to put a 10% tariff, 5% tariff on basically every product that we import. And now he's just floated the much more extreme, insane idea of putting tariffs to be so high that in theory you can replace the income tax with it. Now there's a lot of problems with that. One thing that I'll point out right off the bat is that it seems to literally be impossible to do that, right? That you couldn't replace the amount of revenue that you raise from tariffs with the you couldn't replace the amount of revenue you raise with the income tax with tariffs, right? We import about I think we import about $1 trillion a year worth of stuff, and even if you had 100% tariff on everything that was imported in the country, that wouldn't be enough revenue to eclipse the income tax. And one thing that's important to think about when we're thinking about tariffs is that these also have compositional effects, right? I mean, the point of tariffs is that you import less things when you put tariffs on things, right? And so if you put 100% tariff, like in theory, if you said, we have this much imports, we're just going to put, percentage tax equals to the amount of income tax that we raise currently, and this, whatever that percentage tax comes out to, that's what we end up raising. The problem with that is that practically that's never going to happen, because even if you did that math and said, oh, we need a 250% tariff on all imports to raise the amount of revenue that we get from the income tax, people are going to import a lot less things if all of a sudden importing things is 2.5 times more expensive, right? So, and that's not to mention that your tax base is going to take a shit if you do something like that, because the economy would fucking come to a grinding halt if you actually did tariffs that high. The universal tariffs plan already would cause economic stagnation, much less tariffs that high. Micah, what do you have to say about this plan? Overall, those are my thoughts, plus the distributional effects are quite bad, and we can talk about that a bit later, but what are your thoughts?
This is probably one of the worst tax proposals anybody could ever come up with. It is truly remarkable. Tariffs are close to the most inefficient tax. And as you said, tariffs of this magnitude simply could not replace the income tax. I mean, probably the revenue maximizing tariff rate would be something like 65 to 100%, which would be absolutely disastrous for the price level, be extraordinarily regressive, and be disastrous for the economy. Because it's not just about the products we import, it's about the inputs we import. Those price hikes are not just going to be on foreign goods, but they're going to be on domestic goods that use foreign inputs, which are almost all domestic goods. And so it not only would it do those things, but it also caused massive unemployment. This is something that I think we need to talk about a lot more on the free trade side. People think, or they talk about protectionism as if it's bringing jobs home. What it does do is it shifts the composition of the economy. Every shift of the composition of the economy creates jobs and destroys jobs, usually in equal measure over time. Whenever we opened up trade to countries like China and to other developing countries, you saw shifts in the composition of the economy, reductions of domestic manufacturing, and increases in the production of services and exporting industries. And of course, people are laid off in the meantime, and it's painful and it's hard, but eventually most of those people get reemployed in these growing sectors. In this case, if we had this tremendous increase in protectionism, we'd have a movement in the reverse. We would have a tremendous amounts of job losses in exporting industries and services. And then there would be an increase in domestic manufacturing over time, but there would be tons of economic pain in the short term. And because we don't have a social safety net, some people will not be reemployed. There is no safety net to catch them. And so whenever they lose their job, they might fall prone to opioid addiction, substance abuse, crime, long-term unemployment, loss of skill and human capital. This is the kind of stuff that happens when you have big economic transformations. So I really think Democrats would do well to explain to people just how disastrous of a proposal this is, because it is 10 out of 10 terrible idea.
Yeah, it's a really bad idea, and it's not to mention that I don't know why Democrats haven't mentioned this. Biden mentioned it a little bit in the debate, but he really should have hammered on this. This isn't just a bad proposal for all the economic effects that we talked about, all the mass unemployment and all the inefficiencies created by this. It's also bad because it's the largest tax increase on middle and lower income Americans ever proposed by a president. And the thing is, you're not getting anything out of it, right? Like Bernie, he was honest in saying taxes on the middle class are going to have to go up in order to pay for Medicare for all. Now, whether you believe in Medicare for all or not, whether you think that's the best way to organize our healthcare system, it is something that you are getting for the taxes that you are paying. Right? It is a thing that you get, even if you think that the thing you're getting is not worth the tax you're paying. Fair. It's, you're made in some part whole financially, right? This is just strictly a tax increase on almost every American. The only people, and I talked about this on my channel, actually, there was an analysis done by an institute, which just, it's very intuitive if you think about it, but there's an institute that did an analysis on this. The only people who benefit, who actually end up paying less in taxes than they would end up paying in the increase in prices of goods and services because of these increases in tariffs, are literally people making six figures and above. It's just the highest income people. Everyone else ends up paying substantially more in taxation. So forget about the fact that you have direct job losses incurred because of all of these tariffs. Forget about the fact that in an inflation epidemic that people on the right wing of the party or right wing of the political spectrum are talking about all the time, that you're advocating for a policy that directly increases the prices of all goods and services. You're literally advocating for a huge tax increase as well amongst lower income people, right? Now, the stupidest argument that conservatives and libertarians will make in defense of this proposal, it's ironic in 2024 we have libertarians defending a universal tariff policy. The stupidest argument that they'll make is, well, Econo Boy Micah, we like the fact that tariffs don't raise as much revenue because that means the government has to be a lot smaller. But here's the thing, I don't know if how do I put this? If I thought I was running too fast and I thought, it's dangerous how fast I'm running, the best way for me to stop running so fast isn't to shoot myself in the foot or to cut my leg off. I can just choose to run less fast, right? I can just slow my speed that I'm running. And so if you're a libertarian or you're a conservative who says, well, I don't believe in these expansive government services, I don't believe in this high tax burden, hey, guess what? You can just lower income taxes. You can just decrease the amount of spending on social services. You don't have to destroy the entire economy with universal high tariffs in order to achieve your goal of a smaller government, right? That doesn't make any sense.
Right. So just to summarize, huge job losses, huge increase in prices and robbery of lower and middle income Americans, a huge increase in the national debt, a huge decrease in gross domestic output, and necessarily big cuts to essential government spending on whether it be the military, whether it be healthcare, Medicare, Social Security, cuts across the board. And not even that would be sufficient, though.
But Micah, really quick, something that's worth pointing out in your analysis here is that Trump has not talked about eliminating payroll taxes. So the incredibly interesting part about the people who think that this plan in theory would cause smaller government is the largest buckets of spending that the U.S. government does, period, Medicare and Social Security, would, at least in theory, right, not be cut because of this, because we'd still be collecting payroll taxes. So what is all the other things that the government spends on that aren't Social Security, Medicare? The military, Other healthcare spending that's not paid for with FICA taxes, education. Transitively, and this is something that Biden could also hit Trump on, in order to get rid of the income tax, you'd have to cut non-mandatory spending. So are we gonna cut the military budget in half, Mr. Republican? Are we gonna get rid of like all education spending? Are we gonna get rid of all food stamps? Right? These are the things that would have to be cut in this world. Or obviously you'd have to bite the bullet of cutting Social Security and cutting Medicare substantially and redistributing payroll tax money to pay for everything else. Transitively paying for like the military with a payroll tax instead of income tax. And so
Right.
it's just it's a poorly thought out policy that I don't imagine Trump, like, he's not going to get rid of the income tax if he's president. Would he do universal tariffs? I have every reason to believe that he would, and that would be disastrous enough. But it's just one of those things where you've got a presidential candidate who is suggesting something that he doesn't even seem to understand would be bad. Like if Trump was proposed, the only reason Trump does not sign a bill that gets rid of the income tax and replaces it with tariffs is because all the people smarter around him won't allow that bill to be presented to him. But if Trump was presented that bill, he would likely sign it. And I think it's just a little precarious to have the president be so stupid when it comes to at least like very foundationally basic economic policy, right? Like it's kind of ridiculous.
Right. And let's keep in mind, the Republican Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, Trump's signature piece of legislation, was written almost exclusively by the kind of center-right Republicans which no longer have a home in the Republican Party. Paul Ryan, the former Speaker of the House, who is now an open opponent of Trump and critic of Trump, was the mastermind behind that piece of legislation. Certainly, in the new Trump era, any future tax bill would be much worse. One without any of the pro-growth provisions, any of the attempts to streamline the tax code, and exclusively the kind of right-wing, populist, anti-economy, anti-growth nonsense which defines Trump's GOP.
Yep, exactly. It's just overall just a terrible, terrible, awful idea. Now, to be fair, it does give the Democrats a lot of room to criticize the absolute shit out of Donald Trump, because again, I mean, that's one thing it's unbelievable to me that the Democrats haven't taken a more aggressive stance and aggressive posture when it comes to this proposal, is because for years we've heard, oh, the Democrats are going to tax you more, and implicitly it's always been they're going to tax you more to pay for all these government services, right? It's never like the Democrats have never just been like, yep, we're going to tax you more because why not? That's never been the proposal of Democrats. That's never been anything Democrats have ever proposed, right? But Republicans, at this point, the state of the Republican Party is they can come out and say, yeah, we're just going to tax lower income people a lot more. Period. Right? And we're also going to destroy the economy while we do it. Like, even if you believed in taxing middle and lower income people more, you could just raise the income tax on them, right? But the idea is like, we're going to tax lower and middle income people a lot more and destroy the economy while we do it. While we do it.
Right.
Like, what the hell?
It's clearly absurd. And I think the most insane thing to me is that Trump can propose stuff like this, and we still look at the businesses of America, and it still seems like they're more in the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. And I think that's more of a problem of outreach and messaging on our part than on, and also on common sense on their part, because Trump has shown consistently to not understand what good economic management looks like. He's the guy who said he's going to renegotiate the national debt and practically default on it. And we had a stock market crash when he was president when he said that same day, because this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And so businesses might not like that Biden takes, a more anti-monopoly, antitrust stance, a slightly more pro-labor stance, and slightly more pro-tax stance. But there's a huge difference between the kind of center-left, pro-worker policy that Biden's putting forward and the absolute chaos and destruction agenda that Trump and his sycophants are putting forward.
Yeah, I think this is one of the reasons why I said before the segment started, but we were recording the show, is like it's like, dude, I dare the Republicans to actually enact this platform. I dare them to, right? Because it will fucking lead to the destruction of the Republican Party. Like, it will lead to it will lead to the Democrats getting 65% of the vote in the subsequent presidential election. I mean, we can't overestimate how disastrous a policy like this would be. Like already, like here are my realistic predictions if Trump actually implemented a 10% tariff on all imports. My realistic predictions, right? So this is, is social anarchy going to be caused by a 10% tariffs on all goods coming into the country? No, right? But will it lead to economic stagnation? Will it lead to higher prices than otherwise are being paid, higher levels of inflation? Will it lead to a much more unequal economic system? I mean, the answer to all these questions is almost certainly yes, right? And here's the big kicker. Is it going to lead to a lot more manufacturing employment? No, it's not, right? There's no way that it will. It'll fail to accomplish that goal, even if that is your goal. You know, if you believe in domestic manufacturing, right? The best way to do that is the stuff that Biden has done, right? It's just doing public investments in things like domestic manufacturing, right? There's no reason to make every single consumer product that we can think of much more expensive. Just to play to a pro-populist, pro-manufacturing base. It's just not the smartest way to secure domestic manufacturing. It's certainly not the most equitable way to do it, for goodness sake. It's not the most effective either. So
it's deployed about 5% of the population in like 4 swing states, which is just yet another huge condemnation of our political system, where the interests and beliefs of a very small percentage of the population are elevated so much above the interests and beliefs of the rest of the population.
Yeah, it's pretty unfortunate, but we'll see. If, like I said, if Trump gets elected and enacts that platform, amongst other things on his platform, I think he'll leave office with a 25-30% approval rating. And he'll also, we'll have an FDR level of if Trump did his whole platform, minus the destroying democracy thing, assuming we have a next election, there will be an FDR level of fucking Democrats in the Senate. And that is when shit is going to get real nice after that, if that does happen.
Well, let's hope we don't undergo that chaos and destruction for our good. The whole point of winning elections is to make things better. And so if things had to become much worse in order for us to win, that would be a little bit unfortunate. But I would say that I really do hope there's more of a concerted effort by Democrats. And I think you're seeing a little bit of this, to just let businesses know that, yeah, we're supportive of labor, but that doesn't mean that we can't be better for you than the Republicans. Some have gotten the message, but really 90% of businesses should be in the Democratic column for this election. It really shouldn't be any question.
Yeah, for sure. And to be fair, a lot of the stuff that we advocate for on this show would lead to that happening, more likely, right? Where it's like, we advocate for a more efficient tax code that's less focused on corporate entities and more focused on actually wealthy people and wealthy people's consumption, and state capacity. One of the reasons why countries like in the Nordic countries have such advantageous business environments relative to their level of taxation and their level of regulation is because they have really, really high levels of state capacity and efficiency when it comes to regulating and managing those regulations, right? So it's like, hey, if you're going to have like a robust regulatory state, having a lot of state capacity to manage and wade through those regulations is really, really important. And so doing stuff like that, although anti-business in some sort of intrinsic sense, sure, is pro-business ultimately in a net sense, because you get a more efficient tax code. And even if you have a problem with state regulators, the remedies and the speed at which you would get answers to very important questions is very, very high. So for instance, the last thing that I'll say is a lot of the times when bills get passed, government agencies have to interpret and actually apply those bills. A lot of times that takes forever. So for instance, the IRA, they passed this domestic manufacturing energy community bonus credits for renewable energy. So if you build a renewable energy plant in a coal community, or if you build that plant with American parts, you get extra subsidies, right? But now the federal agencies, they have to interpret, well, what does that actually mean, right? It literally took like a year plus for them to just release what do they actually mean. And so for that entire year, all these companies and all these businesses were like, what do we do? Like, we don't know exactly if we qualify for this or that. Like, we could invest in this project if we get extra subsidies, but we can't if we don't, and we don't know if we do, so we can't make the investment. Like, all these things get delayed. And even though you're trying to do a good thing, the lack of state capacity ends up really hurting your ultimate ability to provide that investment and that subsidy. So these are the things that Democrats hopefully can get a little bit more behind, and get more business leaders to be in favor of them. So
the great thing about an agenda focused on government efficiency and pro-growth policy is that everybody benefits. You're not taking anything from anyone to give to someone else. There's no trade-off. Everybody's made better off. And that's why it's the most exciting area of policy for me, because spoiler alert, in America, the government is not efficient. We have over 100 welfare programs, not very efficient. We have a tax code that is, by all accounts, miserably inefficient, and spending programs all over the place that are miserably inefficient. And so there's so many what might seem as small gains that can be made for the public by some of these changes to our administration of, say, the permitting system or a change of regulations, but they add up. And if you do them all, the impact can be really tremendous, and it can be tremendously positive for pretty much all groups in America, except for those that work in the bureaucracy and the tax lawyers and those who are employed in navigating the complexity of the system.
Yep, for sure. Fully agree. Anything else to say on this before we move on, Micah?
That's it.
There you go, guys. Trump's tax plan, at least the part about income taxes and tariffs, pretty bad. Surprising take from the three wonks.
Or just the two wonks this time. Maybe SDL would have came in and defended these tariffs. I would be surprised.
Yeah, no, I don't imagine. I don't imagine that he. I don't imagine that he would defend any of these policies from Trump.
I know he's not feeling well. I don't think he's had a brain aneurysm, so I imagine he'd be on our side.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Mike, anything else you wanted to talk about before we hang up here? Oh, really quick. How quickly do you think his tariff plans would have a strong effect on the economy? I mean, literally immediately. Yeah. I mean, as soon as they start actually collecting the tax, right? So, I mean, I don't know if there's some like implementation delay that he might enact, but as soon as they start actually enforcing the collection of the tax, then you'll immediately pretty much start to have a lot of effects. So,
So Diogo Barrera asks, I'm confused. Earlier, Micah was saying that using tariffs is better than subsidies to quash national security problems. But why would those same consumer problems not arise in this case? So my argument previously was economic shifts will kill jobs and then create new jobs. And that can have negative transitional effects, right? All economic shifts can leave some people behind. Now, Trump's tax proposal would be tremendous in the quantity of jobs lost. And so if we do think that some industries need to be onshored, or at least transition out of certain countries that we consider geopolitical threats, there's a question about what the best way to do it is. Now, I said tariffs is probably better because it doesn't bias artificially towards America. It just biases against the countries that are our problem, right? So we say like China is a problem. We don't want it to be produced there, but we're okay with it being produced everywhere else instead of saying it needs to be produced here. And your question is, well, hey, isn't this going to cause unemployment because there's going to be an economic transition? Actually, I think that subsidies and tariffs would have a similar impact, but tariffs would actually have less of an impact. It would likely have less of an impact. And the reason why it would have less of an impact is because the actual impact on total trade might not even change. You could just be simply shifting the manufacturing of, say, semiconductors from China to another country. And so your like trade balance is relatively similar. So the job losses in exporters would be maybe relatively minor. Meanwhile, domestic subsidies, I suppose would domestic subsidies lead to layoffs? I suppose if it's financed by deficit spending, I don't think it'd lead to layoffs. But then again, if we're holding this revenue neutral, right? And the reason why domestic subsidies wouldn't lead to layoffs is because it's increasing the velocity of money. So the government's borrowing more money, that increases economic activity in the short run, and so it will have less of a disemployment effect. But if you want to get that outcome while using this more efficient mechanism, which in this case would be tariffs, what you could do is you could just tariff the Chinese goods and then borrow some extra money and spend the revenue from those tariffs on more programs, right? And then I imagine the employment effects will be the same, if not slightly better than domestic subsidies. But just to, in short, tariffs do have this problem, but they just, that, accepting this downside in some very minor, small, narrow cases in which it's necessary to take your strategically important industries out of your adversaries' countries might be worth it. That trade-off might be worth it in some cases.
Exactly. Okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah, I don't have anything else we want to talk about. Shorter episode today, obviously only 2 wonks and only 2 topics. So
people were asking about the French elections.
The French elections, yeah, I mean, it's hard to say how that'll actually turn out because Macron
Right.
will still be president. But I don't know. I think that the French elections will be a very interesting test case. It seems like France is, if there was a country with a worse political environment than America, it might be France. France seems to be teetering on the brink of some pretty bad election outcomes. They've avoided it thus far. They haven't quite elected their version of Trump quite yet. But it's perhaps not going to be looking good in France in the medium-term future. Now, to be fair, I don't know. I mean, when Italy, everyone was saying, wow, Italy elected literally fascists to be in there. Like these people are literally like praising Mussolini type, people that they just elected. And I don't know, haven't really heard much about the Italian government since those elections. It seems like to the extent that they're far right, they haven't really done anything unbelievably insane that garners a lot of attention. And so maybe Marine Le Pen would be the same if she was prime minister, or if she had some lackey be prime minister and then she became president afterwards. But
I wouldn't be too optimistic. I mean, it is a right-wing coalition with even the more right-wing party than Marine Le Pen's, I believe, involved. I could be wrong. Now, the problem with French politics is it's not just the right-wing folks that are extreme. You also have the left-wing extreme. And in both the right extremists and the left-wing extremists are larger themselves than the center. It's like a 35-35, and then there's the 30, which is the center, and that's a very unfortunate position to be in, especially whenever you have a runoff based system. That the center has benefited from strategic voting. Thank God that they've managed to be in control. But you're really effed if either one of the extremes comes into power. I think Mélenchon has a very populist, not economically smart economic agenda, and what seems to be a relatively radical kind of anti-liberal internationalist foreign policy, from what I surmise. Is that your take as well?
yeah, the left in France does seem to be quite extreme a lot of the times. But to be fair, they do seem to be pretty committed electoralists, right? So, like, for instance, in the instances where they've had the Macron-Le Pen matchups, there's been very little sort of apathy amongst the French left, it seems like. It seems like the party leaders are, generally speaking, willing to say, look, we don't like this Macron guy. We don't like him in his weird fucking situation. But, hey, he's not Marine Le Pen, right? We all need to get behind this guy. We need to vote for this guy. And that's what they've done over the last couple elections. And so that's obviously good. Obviously, when you've got somebody running under the label of Communist Party in the year 2024, that's kind of bizarre, at least from an American context. And a lot of these guys do actually have pretty bad policy. Now, to be fair, these guys aren't like Stalinists, for the most part. It's just that they're, a lot of times when you see a European Communist Party member in Western Europe, it pretty much is just like a very, very far left person who believes in a lot of a lot of redistribution. The worst of the far left in Europe is like more Eurosceptic, more like anti-NATO far left, which is certainly a thing in France as well, which is unfortunate, but still better than Marine Le Pen. So, I mean, it's just a pretty volatile political environment in France specifically. Like, it seems like France, Italy, and America might be the most volatile, crazy political environments right now. It's hard to think of other countries. Like, even if you think of, in Canada, right? They're probably going to have a transition in governments. They're probably going to go from the Liberals in Canada, which is the basically the moderate left party, to the Conservatives, which is the moderate right to right wing party. And by all accounts, I mean, yeah, the Conservatives in Canada are not better than the Liberals, but they're not like a fascist party, right? There's not as much systemic risk in electing Canadian Conservatives to your government, but there's probably some serious systemic risk to electing French right-wing nationalists or electing the current Republican Party in America. So it's a scary political time in 2024.
Yeah, well, it looks like incumbents are really just not doing so well. So in Canada, it seems fortunate that their conservatives are not as bad. They still talk about freedom, which is a good thing. It's good whenever your right wingers are talking about wanting freedom and small government, as opposed to wanting really big government intrusion and authoritarianism, and wanting revenge. Right? They're less risky whenever that's the rhetoric. Because less problematic policies come out of an agenda of a small government than an agenda of big authoritarian government. Although there still is a lot of the culture war narrative that they're very much caught up in, and it seems like they're going to be notably less supportive of Ukraine. But in France, it seems particularly bad. Now, we all hope that the far right win and / if it does take power in any of these European countries, it ends up like Giorgia Meloni in Italy, not because she's good, but because she's not actually Mussolini. For a little while, people were concerned. Her party seemed to be filled with people who were fans of actual fascists. And so there was a concern for a little while that she actually might just do fascism. It doesn't seem like she's doing actual fascism, but she's doing right-wing bad stuffism, which is a little bit less existential, but still problematic.
Right. I mean, it's like the difference between electing, I don't know, like, it's like the difference between electing like Nikki Haley versus Donald Trump, right? Like, if Nikki Haley was the Republican nominee, I would be just as vigorously advocating that we vote for Joe Biden, but I wouldn't have this sort of existential fear of the fucking entire future of the country because of the 4-year period that Nikki Haley will be president, right? I would not like a lot of the policies that she enacted. I wouldn't like almost any policy that Nikki Haley advocated for. I wouldn't like the picks that she would make to the federal judiciary. I wouldn't like a lot of the things that she did, right? But I wouldn't be sure to be updating my passport. You know what I mean? Like, that's the type of fear that you get with a guy like Trump, with a lady like Le Pen,
Right.
Unfortunately. So,
But it's like, okay, I can imagine this person being president for 4 years, or being the leader of this country for 4 years, and then after that, whatever damage they did, we could be fine. The world's not going to be fundamentally destroyed. But with people like Trump, it's just simply not that way. Right. It's like, I don't know if we're ever going to be the same again. I mean, we mentioned this in the past. The first thing Trump did whenever he became president of our country was destroy a trade deal which had been in the works for 9 years. And would have brought a tremendous amount of economic development to our country. These are the kind of damaging decisions that you just never recover from, because those trade deals don't pop up all the time. And he made many, many decisions like that, which are still damaging us to this day.
Yeah, unfortunately, elections do have consequences, boys. So you gotta vote. So
Three Wonks today is coming out with a radical proclamation. You should actually vote every single time.
Well, you should vote, and also vote for Biden, right? So don't just vote
Yes.
for Cornel West or something. You might as well vote for something that actually has a chance of being implemented.
There are three parties in America. There's the Democrats, there's the Republicans, and there's irrelevant. And for some reason, there's a certain percentage of the American public which wants to be in the irrelevant party. I know it might feel good to hold up, your candidate, Mr. 0.8% of the vote, or maybe Mr. 2% of the vote junior. But it does have zero impact. And it would be good to express your opinion on a race, especially one with such existential, risks.
For sure. Well, all right, guys, thanks for joining us for another Three Wonks episode. A little bit more political discussion at the beginning and end here. Obviously, our main policy discussions in the middle for the most part of the show. I hope you guys enjoyed, and certainly we'll be back in 2 weeks. Hopefully, Aiden will be feeling better, and he'll be able to join us again. I'm not sure what we'll talk about next week, but I don't know. Tune in to find out. It was a good stream, and we'll see you guys in the next couple weeks.